fans, and welcome back to the Demonland podcast. My name is Andy, and while the D's had a well-deserved break over the bye weekend, Demon fans were gifted with a pre-draft present, with the Dockers falling from 10th to 13th. The Fremantle death ride is back on. Joining me tonight to review our 2023 season so far is George. Good evening, George.
Good evening, Andy. Good evening to Ben Man. Good evening to the Demonland listeners. Well, last week this podcast went for 180 minutes about a Melbourne Football Club game that lasted 100 minutes. How long can we go for this week when the Melbourne Football Club played exactly 0 minutes?
Well, we have played 13 rounds, so if you times however long the podcast was last week by 13, I think you might get close to the mark. Also joining us tonight to review our performances to date as well as preview our run home is Big Man. Good evening, Big Man.
Good evening, George. Good evening, Andy. Good evening, Demonlanders. Another good weekend where we didn't lose a game. Terrific. I used that gag from last year. I'll recycle it.
Well, everyone who I spoke to this week, how's your week? Well, we didn't lose this week, so that's a bonus.
It is a bonus indeed.
Each week I ask our loyal listeners to help us out by providing a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts. We love the feedback and we'll read them out on the show. The 5 stars really do help boosting the podcast and we get more listeners that way. Feebaloo writes, great podcast. Love the dynamic between the hosts, Andy, George and Big Man, provide informative reviews and previews of Demons games. Definitely recommend this podcast. It is the best Demons podcast and the only one I listen to each week. Love the interviews with past and present players and coaches. Thank you, Feebaloo. I appreciate that feedback. Lucy H on Facebook says, really enjoyed last week's marathon podcast after the Pies games. I really appreciate the time and effort you guys must do putting together this quality content together week in, week out. Absolutely love it. Thanks, Lucy. Luann on Facebook writes, nearly 3 hours of Demonland after a win on King's birthday. Life doesn't get any better. So I replied, it was a long one. Sorry, not sorry. Luann replies, thanks so much. I rationed myself so it lasts to the weekend. Heather then added, don't be sorry. I really enjoyed it. So we got a little bit of love on Facebook there. If you follow us on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter, you want to leave us feedback or post a question or a comment for the show, you can post under our podcast post each week or just slide into our DMs. We won't read out your full name on the show. If you want to chat with other Demons fans and you've never been to our forum, head on over to demonland.com, sign up. You can chat with other Demon fans. It's completely free. In addition to being able to post questions or comments for the show, there are also multiple topics and threads on all things Demons related. So join up to join in on the conversation. If you would like to join us on the air tonight to talk about any of the topics we're going to talk about, give us a call on 03 9016 3666. That's 03 9016 3666. I'll answer, I'll put you on mute, and then I'll bring you on when we can. During the week, you can call that number, leave us a message, and we'll play it on the show. If you're listening live, you can join us in the chat room by simply heading on over to demonland.com/podcasts. Now, I said we would be back live on Mondays, but this coming week we're playing on Thursday night. I'll be going away on holidays on Monday. So next week's podcast might be over the weekend. I'll work it out with the boys after the show. Check out our podcast thread on Demonland to see when we'll be live after the Cats game. So there was no match wrap-up this week. We'll jump right into the mid-season review, including our listeners' questions. But before we get into that, I thought we'd take a quick look back at some of the predictions that we made in our season preview show back on the 14th of March. You'll remember that each of us gave our predictions of which team we thought would rise and which teams we thought would fall. And as much as I have been loving the feedback from our listeners about how great we are, their words, not mine, I don't think we can brag about how good we are in terms of our predictions. Myself, in particular, should be banished from ever making a prediction again in my life, and my footy tip results this season are a testament to that. You guys don't fare too well either, except for perhaps George, but George, I think you actually failed the brief because your prediction of a team to rise was actually a team that was already there, so take everything that we say with a grain of salt, but please do keep listening, don't touch that dial. Back in March, I fell for the media hype up of the Carlton Football Club. They were the media darlings in the off-season, despite once again disappointing their delusional fans and missing out on finals again after being in the top 8 for every single round of 2022, except when it ultimately mattered. Foolishly, I predicted as my team to Carlton as my team to rise this season, and after 4 rounds, that seemed like a wise prediction as they drew with the Tigers in round 1, then knocked off the hungover premiership favourites Geelong, and then had narrow wins against bottom-of-the-table teams in the Giants and Kangaroos. Then losses to top 8 contenders, the Crows and Saints, brought them back to earth before their fans hailed them as back in premiership contention with a massive win over this season's easy beats in the Eagles. Then 6 consecutive losses put the Blue Baggers back in their rightful place in the bottom 4. And of course, this week they are once again the media darlings off the back of a second quarter thumping of the inconsistent, finals-less Gold Coast Suns in Melbourne. In the final 9 games of this season, the Blues have only about, I think, 4 or 5 games that they probably could win. And I don't think 10.5 or 11.5 wins will see them making finals. So that's a fail for the Blues again and a fail for me, guys. George, the brief in our pre-season preview was to pick a team that would rise. You picked Brisbane, who finished 6th after we knocked them off in round 23 last season. They ended up making a preliminary final after knocking us off in a semi-final. And I'm not sure it fit the brief as a team that will rise. St Kilda, Essendon, Crows, or even the one we all missed in Port would have been the type of team that fit the brief. But you took Brisbane. They're currently 4th, equal with the Demons and behind us on percentage. So technically they've risen from 6th. By default, you get that one right. What do you say?
Well, mainly I picked Brisbane because I thought they'd actually be premiership contenders, but I'd have to reevaluate that at the moment. Boy, are they an enigma of a team.
Well, you're going to talk more in depth about them later, so...
Yeah, I thought the addition of individual players like Dunkley and Ashcroft would have lifted them. They really didn't lose anybody from last year. But what's really surprised me when you go and look at their wins and losses for this year is they've only won 1 game away from the Gabba to the halfway point of the season. It's just incredible. That was against Carlton, who you've already spoken about. And for the second half of the season, they've only got 4 more away games, and I'm not counting the game against the Suns, which is up in the Gold Coast, or just down the road, sort of thing. So I think they'll get 6 more wins, which will bring them up to 19, which will, I'd guess, get them a top 4 position. But it's not going to get them any further than that. The way they're going, this inability to win away from the Gabba when finals are going to be played, even for them, probably away from home.
Well, Big Man, you predicted that the Western Bulldogs would rise this season. Last year, they finished 8th and snuck into finals ahead of the Blues on percentage. They were bundled out of the finals in the following week, losing to the Dockers in Perth. They currently sit 7th on the ladder, so technically they've risen 1 place, yet they've been a little bit inconsistent this season. The only scalp they've taken has been Brisbane in round 3. And looking at their run home, they have a relatively soft draw. So I expect that they're going to be one of those teams that may be pushing for the top 4. I don't really rate them as a threat. Are you still sticking fat with the Bulldogs?
Well, the question was who was going to rise, not who was going to be a premiership threat. So,
okay, you don't have to say that.
By that definition, I think the Dogs are well in the game still of rising. And as for the ones that I predicted to fall... Swans.
We'll get to.
So on the Dogs, I think the top 4 is really, it depends what the question is.
Well, the question was really, rise, and they finished 8th. They scraped
into the finals last year. I think that they will end up, pushing for top 4. Probably won't be able to get it because they don't have enough wins. And I think the top 4 teams that are in there at the moment are probably likely to finish. So, but I think that they're a smoky. It's just very hard to win outside top 4, but that's not the question. I think they're a team on the rise. One of the things that I think is important is that if history shows that squads win grand finals or squads improve, and that's one of the question marks I've got on Port, is that while it's been thereabouts, they've got a lot of young players who are carrying a big load for that team, whereas the Dogs have got a core group of players who played in the 217 flag. Probably, I'd be guessing, but it'd be 7, 8, 9 players. Their engine room is pretty much unchanged except for Dunkley, who was a big loss, obviously, but in some ways, was probably a win-win in some ways because they had so many of those inside mids. That how many do you need? And you need the outside pace. It's interesting. They've really gone back to that handball style, but that they really look to get territory. So they've changed their game plan a bit. But in the last 4 or 5 weeks, they've started using the handballs quite a lot. And I think that they've got probably the biggest upside of any team outside of the top 4 when you consider Ugelhagen, Darcy, who will come back in at some stage. They've got some quality up there. Norton on the weekend. What's their defender? Who was the ex-Blue?
Jones.
Andy Baxter.
Jones.
Yeah, that's a big out. I didn't actually catch the injury. I just heard that it's a bad one.
Yeah, broken forearm or something, maybe.
Right, that's a really bad one for them because that was their biggest weakness. And so I thought bringing Jones in has really helped their defence and in particular it's helped their ability to intercept Mark. I mean, that's his strength. So they've sorted out some of their defensive worries and they've got a quality forward. It was interesting they threw Norton back because he was a half, he was a centre-half back, as I understand, at different points in his junior career. And so, yeah, I'm still pretty bullish about them. But one thing that's interesting comparing Bevo to Goody, they've got completely different ways of going about selection. And there's been some, I think, justified question marks over Bevo's rotation of so many players through the team. Like Goody's the opposite. He really values consistency, doesn't he? Much to the frustration sometimes of fans who would love to see someone get dropped and someone brought in. And we saw that last year. Obviously, we're getting a bit more fluidity this year in the selection. But geez, you'd be a bit nervous if you're one of those 17 to 24 players at the Dogs because there's every chance you're going to get dropped. So, like West keeps coming in and out of the team. Like that sort of style of coaching is interesting because it doesn't happen very often because systems are so important. If you take someone out and someone comes in. But yeah, I think they're a quality side that probably won't be pushing for a flag. But I think Port are a bit overrated, so they may take Port's spot maybe.
Port, well, okay. Let's talk fails. I predicted that Collingwood would be the team to fall away this season. And with the Magpies currently sitting in second place, and they'll be back on top if they knock off the Crows at the G this week, I think you can well and truly call that a big fat fail. We'll talk more about Collingwood later when we discuss which teams are a threat to our chances for premiership glory. So there's no need to go on about how I'm currently 0 for 2 in predictions. George, you predicted that the Tigers would be the team to take a fall this season. They finished 7th last season, but for a controversial arc call, it might have seen them go at least another week into finals. We would have been playing them, I believe. They've been a little bit up and down this season and currently sit in their rightful 9th place. They've made a case for finals contention this season. They've certainly not fallen away yet. You haven't passed this prediction, but you haven't failed either. So let's watch this space.
Yeah, the Tigers, I think, are facing the inevitable age cliff that comes. I still believe to this day that they won 2 out of their 3 flags on the back of Dustin Martin's boot alone. The first one in 2017 was probably a team effort, but Martin got them 2 more premierships. And unfortunately for Tiger supporters, Dustin is not what he used to be. Cochin is not what he used to be, and I could go through the whole list, and it's just getting older and older, and the number of Tiger players who will appear in the All-Australian side this year will be absolutely minimal. For exactly that reason, all clubs go through this. You recruit a group of players to get you to finals, to get you to premiership status, and those players all start to disappear as they hit that magical 30-year age sort of barrier and beyond, and they've got a lot beyond the 30-year barrier at the moment. We'll talk about Geelong later on, but I think they've hit the same sort of thing in a big bad way. But when you lose the quality of players like the Hoolies and the Rancers and like I said, the real stalwarts of the club just can't get the ball anymore like they used to. It means a slow, painful death for the Tigers, and that's proving to be the case.
A big man like me, you had a massive fail predicting the Pies would fall away, and we can talk more about.
Hold your horses. Hold
We'll
your.
talk about.
When is this? Did I say that they would be? At what point of the season did I say that they would drop?
We're doing it now. At the end of the year, we'll revisit these again. We're just doing up until now. At the moment,
I reject your characterization of a massive fail. I still predict them to drop.
Half a fail.
So,
all right, but let's not talk about Collingwood because I think you're talking about Collingwood later. But you did have
grant you they're doing better than I thought they would be.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, we'll meet halfway.
But it's not an epic fail yet.
No, okay. Well, you've had so far a massive win. Are you going to accept you'll accept the win, won't you? About the Swans?
Yeah, absolutely, of course.
Yeah, well, it's
they're
only
not coming
halfway
back, are they? It's not like they're going to turn around their season. Whereas the Pies, as we'll get into later, have got a very, very tough run home. And now that we've shown the whole AFL the blueprint of how to beat them, I mean, all you need to do now is go down the local newsagent, buy a copy of the blueprint, and you'll knock over the Pies next week.
Well, so the Swans, after making the grand final, they're slumped to 15th to fall from grace. You've so far, and I was going to give you more credit, but I'm going to take back half the credit now. You've hit that nail right on the head.
Which nail?
About the Swans.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, no, exactly. So I'm right on the Swans and still I'm, not conceding the Pies.
Okay.
Got to admire optimism. The Bulldogs are going better than the Pies.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
right.
I didn't say they were going better than the Pies.
Now,
my prediction of them rising has so far been accurate, and so far my prediction of the Pies falling is not yet accurate, but may well be.
I'm glad you're a gambler, Bin Man.
All right, B-Man, over to you. You wanted to, let's go talk stats. You wanted to provide us with some key rankings so far in 2023, so take it away.
Yeah, just a couple of those rankings that I've been talking about. The contested possession, really, I mean, it goes back to contested possession is really the critical thing in footy. And certainly is for us. So in the contested possessions, we're number 3 in the AFL, behind St Kilda and Gold Coast, and both teams and Adelaide are in 4th and Richmond in 5th. And I point all of those teams out because essentially, and Brisbane are 6th. They've all adopted a variation on the Tigers template, which we have too, and we'll get into a bit more in detail later. But where, at the end of the day, it's probably always been thus, hasn't it? Contested, winning the contested ball is absolutely massive. The Pies made a real focus of being better at winning the contested ball, and George mentioned last week how important it was Mitchell coming in for exactly that reason. For someone who can be an extractor and win the hard ball, you've got to, if you want to get it out to your runners, someone's got to win the pill. But they're just below AFL average, down in about mid-table 10th or 11th. So they've still got a ways to go to us. So St Kilda, Gold Coast, us, we were number 1 for a big part of that season, big part of the season so far. Where in terms of our key stats. Meters gain's a funny one because, obviously meters gain, you can, if you're a team like Melbourne who often kicks 60 metres from defence, well, that's meters gain. We're one in differential, AFL 1 in differential meters gained against our opposition. We're number 1 in team to opponent intercepts per game, which is, again, a massive part of we play. So, I mentioned during the year a couple of times that idea that you're twice as likely to score from a turnover as you are from a clearance. Carlton, for instance, have structured their game completely around being a stoppage and clearance team. Similarly, the Suns are in that boat. Collingwood to a lesser degree because they bring the numbers. But it's a problem in the sense that, as I said, you're twice as likely to score from a turnover from a stoppage. And it's if you take away a team's stoppage and that's their key scoring avenue, you're in trouble if that's the way your game is structured. Whereas a team, there's been a couple of examples this year, even last week, where the turnover differential wasn't that great and we were still able to win because we're still scoring from turnover. Our turnover scores have only collapsed once really this year, and I think that was Freo, partly because our kicking was so poor that we didn't take advantage of it. And I think I mentioned this the week after we played them. For instance, we only hit one effective disposal in the entire quarter, in the second quarter against Freo. So we couldn't, I think it was 1-7 from memory or something from turnover. We stopped the opposition getting the ball, so ranked first in least opponent score involvements per game. And that's a really important part of the way we play. An interesting one from we're third in intercepts, I mentioned before, third in turnovers per game. That's a critical stat, as I mentioned. So obviously the differentials, we're one in the differential, but third in the totals. Fifth in least opponent effective disposal. So we put pressure on the opposition, make it hard for them to use their kicking, which is so critical against a team like Collingwood, is that it's really about making sure that many of their kicks, because it's so important to the way they move the ball and transition it, are under pressure, and and not only because it minimises their chance of creating a scoring chain, as I just mentioned, it allows us to play our turnover game less sort of we're also one that I think is really important, because this was a issue that was brought up in our mid-season review last year as something that was a real issue for us, and it ended up becoming never improved really, was our tackles and pressure inside 50. We're third in the AFL for tackles inside 50. So, the sort of quiet criticism in recent weeks of Cozzy, for instance, Spargo, Nibbler not so much, but I think that that's a really good stat to remind us that those fellas are doing their work. One stat from a negative perspective that I thought was really interesting was we're 12th in contested marks per game, which really surprised me, because we've got obviously Maxi, and we've got Brody, we've got a good marking team generally.
Well, Max was out for a chunk of games as well.
Yeah, that's right, and T-Max out and Brown's out. Mm-hmm. But I think it goes to show there's a sort of a shift in footy. I mean, oppositions are putting so much time now into stopping their opponents mark the footy, and we are too. And that was a real feature of our game last week against the Pies, is we really worked hard to make sure that we minimise the amount of times they got intercept marks or even marks around the ground. And it's interesting watching players now. You can see it in other teams as well. There's quite often like a basketball double-handed pat down when they don't necessarily always go for the mark. And there's clearly this thing of multiple people going up in contests. So it's incredibly important to get the ball to ground and to win the ball once the ball hits the ground. And so that's an area for us that we're waxing a little bit in terms of waxing and waning a bit in terms of where we're at with that ground ball. But I think it's really improved in the last few weeks, which is a real positive. So yeah, they're the key stats. I don't know what the season average, for instance, for time in forward half, but I suspect it's probably something like 55-45 over the season. And there was one more. So from stoppage clearances, just as an example of that, centre clearances, Brisbane are number one in the AFL. Port, we're way down in 9th from centre clearances. Stoppage clearances, we're way down in, let's right there. We're down in 16th for stoppage clearances. And again, that goes to the shift in footy, really, because where our focus is on creating turnovers, not on winning stoppages. And it goes back to that conversation that we've had multiple times, really, last season and this season, but more this season, about how valuable is a clearance in of itself. And as George noted last week, it's all about the quality of the clearances. And it just shows, we're sitting pretty well on the ladder. We're scoring well, and we're 15th for clearances. From stoppage clearances. So, that part of that is, as we've talked about often enough, part of that is because of our choice not to bring even up numbers at the stoppages, and have the player that would otherwise be at the stoppage sit behind the ball to give us an opportunity to intercept. Again, that's one of our key scoring ways we score. So I think footy's really evolving away from clearances being as critical as they were even 12 months ago, I reckon.
All right. Let's move on because we've got a lot to talk about. At the midpoint, it's not quite the midpoint. We're already past the midpoint. So turning into the home stretch, the D's sit in third place on 9 wins, 4 losses. In comparison to the same point in the season last year, we had won one more game. We're sitting in second on the ladder with 10 wins, 3 losses. Our percentage was about comparable with last season. It's 132% this season as opposed to 134% last season. Our record this season against top 8 teams is 2-3, and we're yet to play the Saints and the Crows and only play Brisbane again of the current top 8 teams. This time last year, our record against teams that were currently in the top 8 at round 14 was 2-2. We had only beaten the Saints, who didn't end up making the finals, and the Tigers. We had lost to Sydney and Fremantle. We hadn't played Brisbane, Geelong, Carlton, who were in the 8 at the time, and we had lost to Collingwood, who weren't in the finals at the time. They ultimately made the finals, and we had beaten the Bulldogs, who weren't in the finals, and then they ultimately ended up making the finals as well. So we're in a similar position this season as we were last season in terms of our win-loss record and our performance against or lack of performance against contenders. In the first half of last year, we had only travelled interstate 3 times. This season, we've travelled 5 times already, and we've got 2 more actually coming up in the next 2 weeks. We've travelled to the Cattery and then Alice Springs. George, are there any comparisons you can make to us last season and this season? And keep in mind, we've got questions coming up about the run home, so keep the comparisons up to the bye.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at it last season at this point and this season. I'd remind people firstly that although we've had 9 wins so far and 10 last year at the same point, percentages, within 2% of each other. And our losses, let's be realistic, against Port by 4 points, Freo by 7 points, Brisbane by 11 points after a disastrous start, and Essendon are the most at 27 points. So really we could very easily be at the position of being on 11 wins. That's guess. But what was interesting about those losses, I think each of them has their own explanation. The loss to Essendon was after a 6-day break, and that was after a trip to Western Australia against the Eagles. We had a 6-day break against Port, and that was a wet game, very exacting, and again we only lost by 4 points in that. The Freo game, we had an 8-day break, and that's fine. But again, it was after that wet Port game where it was really exacting. And as it's proven, Port are the top team in the ladder and very contested. It was a tough, hard game. So it's not surprising we weren't at our best in the Freo game. The Brisbane game in the round 2, we've talked about the loss of Max and the effect that had on the team. But again, it was a 6-day break after playing the Dogs in the first round. Again, everybody's fit and healthy in the first round, and it was a tough, hard game. So our losses have been minimal against teams on short breaks and against good competition. Let's face it, it's been good competition. The only exception probably being the Freo game. But like I said, that was after a wet game against the top contested team probably in the competition at the moment. And just as a reminder, last year at this point, Brisbane were top with a 10-3 record. Fremantle were third with a 10-3 record, and what happened to them? And the 2 teams that played off in the grand final, Geelong and Sydney, were 4th and 7th respectively, with 9 wins and 4 losses for Geelong and 8-5 for Sydney. So just shows things can have changed in the second half. Now, Binman talks about the loading. I keep on talking about the injuries, and again, I don't think people really appreciate the extent of the injuries, but not just injuries that keep players away from the game. It's the injuries that players are carrying through the games to get to the final stage. And we had a shocking run last year from the Collingwood game on. We lost T-Mac. I'll remind people we had Mitch Brown playing in the forward line against Collingwood last year. Easy to forget that sort of thing. At season end, I spoke that we had 6 players: Gawn, Rivers, Salem, Pickett and Petty all carried bandages into the final game on their knees into the final game. All of those players are carrying some sort of knee or strain injuries. Petrarca, remember, had a broken leg. Oliver had finger surgery a couple of weeks before the finals.
Selwood kicked his thumb and broke it.
Yeah.
corresponding
And
game.
I believe
Yeah,
Fritsch also had some injury as well, I've been told.
And people forget that in round 16, Gorn had a foot injury with syndesmosis, and at the same time, around about then, Magic Door quit the game and left us with Wiedemann as our backup ruck, while and Jackson was expected to take the whole load in the absence of Gorn. So it wasn't surprising when we sort of struggled into the final with these players who were quite literally the walking wounded. Not surprising. In sharp contrast, Geelong at the end of the home and away season in the last round only had two regulars unavailable, Dangerfield and Segler. Dangerfield came good for the finals, of course. In round 22, Brisbane only had one regular player unavailable, Tom Berry. Sydney only had one regular player unavailable, which was Naismith. Their backup ruckman, I don't think is there anymore. And in round 20, for example, we had Ben Brown out as well. Lever was out. T-Mac was still not back. Joel Smith. We were the walking wounded going into the second half of the season. But I think it's important to remember that all of these injuries can happen at any time. We're looking good at the moment. We're in a reasonably good space in terms of it, but it can happen to any team, including us. So if we manage to keep those players not only on the park but in good physical condition, we will be challenging yet again, and so will the other finalists, or certainly in the grand finalists, be in the same position. It's the best team on the day with the best list available and the players in the fittest position.
Absolutely, and I mean that's always the case, isn't it? And I think injuries for me has always been the biggest determining factor. You just can't, if you take especially now, I mean, back in the day, what were the lists in the mid-80s? They were, or even in the early, you're looking at 50s, weren't you, at one point, with a list of 44 and the talent pool relatively thin with all of the other sports about, that good athletes can play. Injuries take a bigger toll now than ever, I think, in terms of, anyway, you lose 3 or 4 of your best players. I mean, I think we saw last week the impact of losing DeGoey and Sidebottom out of the Pies team, equally for us with Oliver, of course. It's interesting you mentioned the injuries, because I totally agree that was a huge factor last year. There's a really excellent post by a poster, a Speed Demon, good name, in a thread on Demon Land called the Tactics Game, Tactics thread, that I read just before earlier tonight. And he made the point about injuries, connecting it to loading, that Selwyn Griffith in the Demon Land podcast said that once the season starts, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, that they're 70% of their aerobic, of keeping up their aerobic levels. Training can only give, the match itself can only give them 70% of what they need to do, and then they have to, the rest of it has to be in the training. But he made the point that if the players are carrying an injury into that, to that training during the week, that maybe they're not able to do the aerobic, and so that it has a lag effect for the entire season. So if you only can maintain 70% of your level aerobically from games and not able to fully train, like, for instance, Salem wasn't able to for big chunks of the season, like Hibbo wasn't able to for big chunks of the season, maybe, you can't do any running because you're carrying a knee, then, maybe you never can get your aerobic capacity, even with all of the development back. And that's what it looked like at the back end of last season, is that we were just running out of puff. It was, in hindsight, my optimism hoped that we could overcome it. But, we went hard in the first half last season and we ran out of puff. Speed Demon makes the excellent point that in the back half of the season, I think, I might get the numbers wrong, but there was, in all of our losses, we were at least 21 points up in the second half of each of those losses, in the second half, not in the first half, in the second half. So the Pies, we, were well ahead of the Blues, who came back. We won that game. And so, I think we're in much better shape than we are last year at this point in time, mainly because of injuries, fitness-wise. But I really like the different approach that Goody's taken to this year. So, as I mentioned before, football's partly a copycat copycat industry in a way. You look to the previous year's premier to take from them what, help them win the flag. It's absolutely what we did. We looked to Richmond as the template. I'm a massive believer Richmond have created the template for how the game's played at the moment. But the other factors for us is that we looked to Geelong last year. Geelong looked to us. And last year was really interesting because we stuck with our defensive game plan, and we were just almost, Goody said at one point, didn't he, is that we don't care how much we score by. We want to keep the opposition to, a low score. That's what our focus is. And they look like they carried that through. And as they did, oppositions obviously were looking to find a way to beat us. And the only way to beat that defensive press was to move the ball quick. And that's where Collingwood landed, was the only way to beat us, was to move quick. And we couldn't adapt in the second half, I think, because of the fitness. I think because of the injuries. We couldn't spread and cover the way that we needed to be able to do to keep our defensive structure in place. This year, I think we're taking so many elements. If you listen to what Goody said, we're taking so many elements from the Cats. We're managing our older players, Hibbo getting rested, managed, for an example. We'll talk about selection this week coming up, but I've got a feeling that there will be some non-selections of best 22 players. That's my vibe. And we've taken other elements of Geelong, one of which is this idea of experimenting. Goody never talked about experimenting till this year, and he has been really open from the beginning of the year about keeping the players fresh mentally, different players, using the time on ground much differently, using the bench differently. They haven't actually done it, but they talked at the beginning of the season about using the sub as either a tactical or a load management. I don't think it's been used very often as a load management, would be my vibe. But rolling different players through different positions, more players in the centre. That's been a real feature of this year. Whereas the first half of last year, it was like we had our template and we were waiting for teams to try and do something, and we were sticking with that until they did. Meanwhile, Geelong went to town on our 21 season. And at the midway season, they lost, I think they were 7-4 after halfway. Then they got rolling in the back half of the season, the way they managed their senior players. I reckon a really important thing about last year is, and it goes to our conversation a bit later about our contenders, is I think the Pies have tricked everyone in terms of thinking about, well, what is the way of playing? They haven't achieved anything yet. You don't follow a team's template who hasn't won a flag. And so who do you follow? In this case, you follow Geelong's. Geelong won the flag last year, copying our game plan and our methodology. And we've taken that what they've learned from us, and we've made some changes to it. I think that tactically we've tried a whole lot of different things, but it's a few smoke and mirrors to a degree. I don't think our game plan's changed that much, but there's been some tweaks, and it's around the ball movement, particularly in the beginning of the season, in the first 5 or 6 games when we're fresh. I think we're in a much better position than we were last year just because of the fitness. We're clearly fitter. We're running out, we're in the first third of the season at least. It was really hard to tell last year where our fitness was because teams, remember that game against Port? They did barely cross the halfway. That first game we played against Port, they barely crossed the halfway mark of the ground for the first half. So teams weren't ever going to beat us. It was a bit like the game on the weekend, is that we weren't, that type of game plan where teams aren't coming at us and running fast isn't particularly aerobically taxing compared to chasing tail like Collingwood do. So I think we're in a fantastic position. It's exactly where they want to be. I've heard the coaches say that a number of times, different people at the club. This is exactly where we want to be. It was a really important win last week because if we'd lost that, then we wouldn't be where we want to be. But 9-4, I think we're in really good shape.
All right, I'm going to bring this. We're going to talk next the run home, but I'm going to bring this injuries point up because we've just been talking about injuries at the back end of last year. So this year, it's not news to anyone that our forward line has remained unsettled for most of the season with injuries to key position players. Ben Brown, Tom McDonald, Harrison Petty have all been sidelined throughout the season. Down back as well, we were very unsettled early on with injuries to key position personnel, with May, Lever and Hibberd being unavailable at times, Petty being swung forward, and the decision to go smaller in defence over the three talls also had a bit of an effect on team structure. In the past few weeks, we've been without one of our stars in the engine room, with Clayton Oliver missing the past 3 weeks. And don't forget, we were without Max Gawn for a block of about 4 weeks while he recovered from an MCL injury sustained in our early in our round 2 match against the Lions. George, how have injury...
And hold on. Sorry, and also Petty. Did you mention Petty?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been huge given BB's not fit and T-Mac aren't fit. He's massive out.
George, how have injuries to critical key position players affected the season to date?
Surprisingly, they haven't affected it a great deal, and I think it's the nature of the injuries. We're desperate. The nature of the injuries, but also the people we've had to replace them. We haven't been as affected last year. And because of the management as well, we've actually given people a proper break away from the game who needed it, rather than people coming back after 2 weeks when they needed 4 weeks.
We're not rushing back, and even the words about Oliver coming back this week.
We see the example with Salem, for example. He had to do a decent block of training to basically, first half of the season almost, to get up to the required level. And Salem has come back looking absolutely primed to play the second half. He is back to his best by any stretch. Max was out for 4 weeks, but when Max has come back, Max looks like Max of old, and that's what we want to see. Big comparison with last year when we had people like Lever coming back and never regained their best form. I think we're doing the same thing with Petty. We've been fortunate with the fixture with him as well to be able to give him the time away to come back to his best. Oliver, the same thing. Well, it's just unfortunately one of those things that happens. But we probably could have brought Oliver back last week.
The blisters.
Apart from the fact that he was in hospital, but it's all about the management of when they're coming back. They're looking like they're ready to play football again. Whereas last year we were desperate. We were putting players on the field simply because we had no one else to put on the field. Like I said, we were playing Mitch Brown in the forward line. Tomlinson was trying to replace May in the back line. There was all sorts of things going on. When Gawn was out last year, we had Luke Jackson doing all the rucking and Wiedemann as a backup ruck. It's not the situation this year.
Yeah, and I think, George, that's a really good point about kudos must go to the fitness team and also the medical team for that. It also sort of intersects with what I was saying about learning from the Cats. Even in the presser today of Goody talking about the game on Thursday night, there's seemingly a much more preparedness to say, well, it's a bit of a cliche, we're not going to take any risks, but it doesn't sound like they're going to take any risks. And last year they did take some risks, didn't they? There was a few times where, I know that there's that resilience thing and there's that whole conversation, but there were a few times last year where there were players that were clearly hindered that you could see. I mean, I remember we went to that training, this is later in the season, but remember before the Brisbane game we went, they had the open training and it looked like it was walking wounded. There was more bandage there than your average Osseo. It was incredible how many players had different, bandages on their knees, thighs, ankles, whatever. But the other thing with that, though, for the injuries, I underestimate the impact of them. Our system and our structure and our discipline it protects us from some of our key players. But with Salem, how effective he was this week, he is he's a top 10 player for Melbourne. And of course, you're going to have an impact when you lose a player of that quality. Your system, will protect, your team to a certain degree. And I think that's, one of Goody's major strengths is it's not just the system, it's the discipline of everyone in that team to play their role and not move away from their role. That protects when you lose a player of Salem's ilk, where another team might struggle, would be more impacted by the loss of Salem. So, for instance, I know I'm banging on about the Pies, is that their system is much more likely to be impacted by taking a key component out. So leaving side bottom aside, as like I said, you take DeGoey out and they don't have enough of those physical ball winners. You take him out and suddenly their system loses a bit of its strength. So, but nonetheless, I think having Maxi out for 3 games, he's really, that was his best game for a long time, I thought, since he's come back. I'm not sure about what you guys think, against the Pies. And even then he looked pretty sore. So, you can't, I think I underestimate it because we've done so well at protecting it. But remember, we had Hibbo come out, just before a game. We had Lever come out just before a game. And I think that was the Essendon game. One of those two was out. Maybe it was Hibbo.
Lever was out of the Essendon game and Hibbo came out before the Gold Coast game very late and Turner replaced him.
And sometimes I find it useful to imagine I barrack for another team and you go, well, let's say Stewart goes out of the Cats team. Well, not even if you barrack for him. If you were just objectively looking at the Cats, and we're about to play the Cats next weekend, and an hour and a half before the game, Stewart gets pulled out of the team, every Melbourne fan would go, oh, that is brilliant. That is massive. What a big leg up it is for the Ds. Whereas there was barely a ripple of, oh, wow, that's such a huge out having Lever come out before that Essendon game. You know what I mean? It's partly because we've been so brilliant at being able to cover for losses, and that can be sheeted home to the system. It can be sheeted home to the system, but the commitment of that team playing that system for a number of years. And, for me, that's a really critical thing, is about teams that win flags. They're a unit that know each other and play really well inside a system that they've been playing for years. So this doesn't start now or last year or 21. This goes back to 2017. Every single game from then is a building block to where we are now, which is why I question Port's bona fides, because they've been there and thereabouts, but I don't think they've had a consistent system that like we have, that they can do instinctively. That I'm not saying that they're not playing well and they're not a good team, but the advantage for us, and that's why I think the Dogs are in a similar boat. They've had a unit that has played in a particular way together for a long time, and I think that takes teams a long way.
Just on the Oliver playing this week, and we'll talk more of that a bit later. Last year, if this game coming up was last year, I'd have no doubt that he'd be brought back in. But now I'm not too sure, even. And I'm going to play a clip from Goody a bit later on, and I'm not sure if he's foxing or not. But we'll see what happens.
And that's for me is an example of what I was saying about the shift in philosophy.
Yeah,
and what I mean. A lot of D's fans were calling out for it last year on Demonland. It was all over Demonland. We had this discussion 6 or 7 or more, probably every week for the back half of the season. Why aren't we rotating players? Well, we don't have anyone to bring in, all of that conversation. And this year they're doing it. All of the things that they committed to at the beginning of the season, we're going to be more aggressive with our ball movement. We're going to play different players through the centre. We're going to try different mixes up forward. We're open to, a too tall defence and trialling that. They've done that. They've done all of those things. And as I've said a number of times, I think you just got to listen to Goody. I mean, he doesn't bullshit. He says this is what's happening. I think if you just listened to Goody and didn't listen to the media, you would have a pretty clear picture of where we're at. And he's the best place to start was today's presser. Our DNA is defense first. I think that's a bit of a ducks and drakes thing, though. He's reinforcing that he doesn't want anyone to be talking about our scoring power.
Bigfoot says, the podcast has gone to another level this year. My sincere thanks to all involved. Each of you brings something different to the table. It's very clear that a lot of time and effort goes into the format and analysis. If you have time, I would love to get your thoughts and opinions on our run home. What are the danger games, and are you concerned that our potential lead into finals could be deemed as soft with games against Adelaide if they still can't win out of South Australia, Richmond if finals are out of their reach, North in Tassie, is our Tassie hoodoo over, Carlton, hopefully Blind Freddie, we'll see they are tanking by then, Hawthorn, just lay down for us this time, you've got nothing to prove, and the Swans, hopefully they are not playing for their coach's swan song. Keep up the great work. Love the podcast. Big man, have you had a good look at our run home and what do you make of it? What are the danger games, and are you concerned that we could have a soft lead into finals?
I was last year I was sort of putting my optimistic hat on and trying to pump up. It was really, that sharp and steel or whatever it is coming into the finals, trying to reframe our run home. But we had an extraordinarily tough run home last year. And part of that was, there were a number of factors, but playing Brisbane, we flogged them. But what was interesting, the warning sign really was the second half of that game, is that they came back and we were out of gas in the second half, but we'd already won that game. We had the Blues the previous week in a finals like game that we win with a Cozzy goal just near the siren, and it was a thrilling victory, but emotionally very draining. The Pies the previous week from memory, that is 3 tough games to lead in the finals. I take the line through Geelong last year. There's so many similarities to our season this year to Geelong's season last year. And one of them, and I think the most important one, is their run home was super soft last year. Now, I'm of the view that now I've changed my opinion from last season. I think it's fantastic that we've got the run that we've got home, because, our run home, we go, so Cats this weekend coming off a 9-day break. We've then got the full 9 days, 10 depending on how you count it, but 9 into the Giants game. We're then Saints at Marvel Stadium. That's a 6-day turnaround, unfortunately, with the travel. So that's not a great one for us, but that's our worst one. So then we've got another 6-day break, but that's the Lions at the G. But from that point, we play the Crows with full 8 days. And I'm making a point about the break because there's no question in my mind that cumulative short breaks was a huge factor that we probably should have talked about in the first half of the season. It was our fixture was super hard this year, much harder than it was last year in terms of our travel and in terms of the number of 6-day breaks. And that was a point Selwyn Griffith said way back in March was a challenge for them. And it was interesting. Goody's mentioned it a few times during the season. So that we've got a couple of 6-day breaks, but that St Kilda game into the Lions game, but both of them are in Melbourne, so there's no travel. There is travel from, obviously, we fly out from Alice Springs on the Sunday, the boys get back in their beds at 2 or 3 Monday morning, probably don't train, obviously, on the Monday, back at the club on Tuesday, and then, suit up for a game on the Saturday. Then after that, it evens out in terms of the breaks are all okay. So we've got the Crows in Melbourne at the G, then full week at the G again to play Richmond. We then play North a full week. That's down in Tassie, but with a week, and it's it's not across the side of the country. Then a 6-day break with the travel, so that's not great. But that's Carlton, a night game, which I'm not thrilled about night games because of I'm not sure how we go with the slippery conditions. 8-day break into the Hawks. So we finished, and then the last game is away at the SCG. We don't know when that will be. That's not been, is the Swans. That's a terrific run home. And that is very similar in terms of the difficulty of the Cats. And it means that 2 things. It means that, we're a good chance of winning, probably 6 games on the run home, and some of those getting to play Roos and Hawthorn again, notwithstanding Hawks' improved form, but it doesn't really matter. Hawks will look to attack. They've already put that's their game plan. So there's every chance we will hammer both of those teams. So percentage is going to play a big factor in our finishing position. One of the wild cards in the top 4 will be Port and Brisbane. Those are wild cards because both of them have got a massive home advantage, but in particular Brisbane. Brisbane just don't lose at home. So, they beat Melbourne and they beat Collingwood up there this year. So anyone who has to play up in the Gabba in, say, week 1 of the finals, the Brisbane doesn't matter who it is, even if it's us, Brisbane are likely to go into that. If they finish top 4, which is likely, they're going to start favourite in that. So percentage will play a huge factor, and we've got a chance to pad our percentage a little bit, get it over 140. And we'll talk about Collingwood's run home in a bit later. They've got the opposite draw. They've got a really difficult draw with multiple 6-day breaks, and their percentage, is unlikely to increase, I would say. So I think we'll finish the season on the most percentage. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. The team that finishes top of the ladder doesn't win the flag very often, as we talked about last year. Or remember we talked about it in 21 when I said the same thing, and then we finished top by beating Geelong down there for the first time since '64, I think that was. So, I changed my tune on that one as well. So it's a really, really good run home, and it means that some of those lower pressure games, they will have the opportunity to rest a Hibberd. They will have we couldn't rest anyone. We couldn't afford to lose the Pies game. We lost it. We couldn't afford that. Then that made the Blues game, just a must-win game. No one was going to get rested. And Brisbane became a must-win game, and no one was going to get rested. We'll have the option in those last 3 weeks to manage players should we want to.
Skrull says, "Hey Demonland family, I'm relatively new to the podcast, having been recommended to listen a few weeks back by a lovely lady near the Demon Army Cheer Squad. This is my first message on this website, and I want to relay my thanks and gratitude to you 3 for your considered analysis and the use of stats to paint the bigger picture that can sometimes be hazy in all the emotions of game day. The wins can be euphoric and the losses can be soul-crushing, but I have found that listening to your dissections of the matches in the past few weeks have given me a greater appreciation of the games and have made me realise that it's a long season and we're playing the long game. Thank you for your efforts to bring comfort after a loss and, of course, to celebrate all the wins along the way. I've heard you speak about us adjusting our game plan slightly this year, but as I'm relatively new here and not very analytical when it comes to how I watch games, I would like a bit of an explainer about what you've noticed about our tweaks to the game plan. Correct me if I'm wrong, and apologies for my ignorance, but I've seen a shift from us playing predictable down-the-line footy, which did work for us in 2021, to us taking the game on more by taking risks in using the corridor. I know it's not as simple as that, and there is probably a lot more that my untrained eye is missing, so can you please enlighten me? So that the next time I'm at the footy, or probably more accurately at the pub, I can pretend that I know what I'm waffling on about. Thank you for your time. Keep up the stellar job, guys. Now, B-Man, you are our expert on the game plan. What differences have you seen this year in terms of our game plan and the way that we've played over the last few seasons? And then when you're done talking about changes to the game plan, Stu has a great observation about how other teams exploited our game plan last season, and then asks a great question about whether any of those changes that were to our game plan that you'll be talking about in a minute, whether they've left us susceptible to other teams' counter game plan to beat us, layers upon layers, a bit of Inception stuff. So first, if you could answer Skrull's query about the changes we've made to our own game plan this season, and then I'll ask Stu's follow-up question after that.
I don't think we've made major game changes to the game plan. Is that the whole AFL is definitely moving quicker. You can see Carlton. I spoke about Carlton at the beginning of the season and said they're just not fit enough, and that's how it's panned out. They're just not fit enough, are they, to the Blues? And that means 2 things. One is that they're stuck in that stoppage game that I talked about before. Like a couple of years ago, scores from stoppages was critical. It's no longer as critical as it was. There's still teams that build their whole model around it, Brisbane being one of them, the Blues being another, the Suns being one. We're not one of those teams, and we're moving away from it, in fact, as being a key scoring source. So turnovers has always been a key scoring source for us, and intercept marking is a big part of that. I mean, if I was to say the Goodies presser today is a brilliant presser because he talks about what the DNA is, and one of the themes that he's been talking about all season, much more than last year, much more than last year, is that point that was made. I forget in the first question you asked, Andy, about this idea that it's a long season. And that we're all about being our best. Goody has made that point now. I must have heard him say that 10 to 12 times, no exaggeration, that it's all about the end of the season. Even today, he reinforced it again. But the changes to the game plan, I would say, it's a bit hard to... I would break the season up into those three periods. That first period, rounds 1 through to about rounds 8 or 9. In that period, we were definitely moving the ball faster, definitely taking a line through the fast transition from the way the Pies look to move the ball. We were taking more risks, absolutely. So, that idea of the risk reward, we were turning it up towards, taking riskier options. We brought in Hunter to enable us to do that, and also play the wing could give us two options. But a big part of that was bringing in elite kick. We brought McVee into the team too, so that's a second elite kick. We've got Salo back, that's third elite kick. We've got Bowie, who's an elite kick, and we've got Fritter. But those first four that I mentioned are super important to our game plan because they do allow you to take a risk. I don't want Nibbler, as much as I love him, I don't want him or Hibbo taking a kick into the corridor. And if you notice, they don't. You put it in the hands of the players. This is what Collingwood do. And so this is what we've taken from Collingwood's game, which is put the ball in the hands of your elite kicks, let them take the high-risk kick, or if they can't, to make sure that they control possession. But I think so in that first 5-6 games, and we could score, we scored over 120 points 3 times. Yep. So 135 points, 129, 126. We put some big scores on the board, and that was on the back of a decision really to be more aggressive, which is what the question. If you compare it to the first half of 21, 22, they're barely comparable, are they? The way we were moving it, we went out to show the opposition, I think, that we can score. Right back to the 2 practice games, we were looking to move the ball super quick, but it's still the DNA, as Goody says, is the defense. The thing about that defense is that other teams, we talked about this, we've got that triangle defense where we always want to play it back, and we engineer that by having one less at the stop who can drop back. Gus, there's a question about Gus. He plays a really important role in that, or has done. There's a question mark on, how many halfback flankers can you have? It's an interesting question. But players who drop back. So the other thing that has changed a little bit is that, those kicks inside 50, we're being a lot more kicking to the top of the goal scorer, which is, again, must please fans no end because of all the criticism. And I suggest that's an analytics thing, is that the analytics have probably shifted, but it's also partly a shift in the, how aggressive, because it's riskier to kick to that spot. So one of the stats that I read before is critical for that. So being, I think I said number 3 in tackles inside defensive 50, forward 50. That means that we can be more aggressive. If we're winning more ground balls, when the ball comes into our forward line, there's less risk of it bouncing straight back out. So if I was to summarise the key changes, I would say exactly as Scroll said, is that a bit more aggression. Now, this middle part of the season is what I found fascinating is Goody's, he said in the lead up to even the Port game, is he mentioned DNA. Defence is our DNA. Gus was on 360. What did he say? He was asked, tell us what Melbourne's game plan is. He said, defence is our DNA. The next week, Track was on 360. On the couch, Gus was on, and then Track was on 360. He was asked the same question. Defence is our DNA. It was like they were theming up something for getting people prepared. And then we went into ultra defence against the Blues. We stopped their movement. So a team that came into that match and said that we are going to attack and we're going to move the ball quickly, we completely stopped their ability to do that. And it's exactly what, as we talked about at length last week, that's what we did to the Pies. So for me, that's this middle block of the season, which I think will continue next week, maybe even into the Giants game. But then when we get to the third act, the third part of the season, I'm pretty confident that we'll revert back to that aggressive style, but it's all based on the same defence. I think one of the critical things for, when the ball's moving so quickly down the ground is to slow it down. You've got to slow it down even a little bit to enable that, lever to be that interceptor, to enable not to get, teams want to pull us apart. They want to create one-on-ones against us, and we want to do the opposite. And the only way to do that is to stop the ball moving quickly. I think a lot's been made of football being different. I actually don't think we have changed our game plan very much. I'd characterise it as tweaks. It will look different come finals than what it's been played now. That was my analogy of V8s bumping to, around Mount Panorama as opposed to F1s. What I mean by that is that they'll just be faster. Everything will be faster come finals, but our fundamentals will remain the same. So contested ball, winning turnover, and defence. I think that defence wins games of football, don't they? Win flags in all competition. Defence is the heart of it. So, I don't think there's radical changes, but it's been fun, in terms of watching it, because Goody has been much more creative and people enjoy it, different roles, different looks, different things. I think part of that, though, is messing with the opposition, to be honest.
So Stu says, thanks, guys. The 3-hour loading podcast last week was great. I'm sure you guys will be delivering explosive podcasts from round 20 onwards. So that's a bit of a loading joke for you there, Bin Man. Last year, we saw teams adopt specific strategies as a way to counter Melbourne's game plan. This included Number one, stronger use of the corridor. Number two, short and quick 15 to 20 metre kicks to allow transition by hand or foot beyond Melbourne's defensive zone. And three, when we kick to a long contest, spoiling the ball long and well clear of the contest to circumvent our crummers and contested ball winners. Geelong used all three to great success in our round 17 game last year. Over the first 13 rounds, we've seen what the D's response to these strategies from 2022 has been, with particular success in our wins against the Swans in round 3 and the Pies in round 13. We seem to have developed a counter strategy to how teams beat us in 2022. Go fast and we can beat you. Go slow and we will definitely beat you. Given this, have you seen anything in our losses this year that suggests we're susceptible to a new strategy or game day tactic? Was there anything about how Essendon and Port move the ball against us that causes you concern? Sorry for the long question and thanks for the continued high-quality content you gents produce. So, Bin Man, following up from that question about the changes to our game plan in 2023, have you seen anything this year to suggest that we're susceptible to a new strategy or game day tactic from our opposition, in particular, anything you noticed from our losses?
Just one sort of a related point is that one of the huge advantages this year for us is we're not the hunted. And that's what Goody's doing. He's engineering that. He's batting away those questions. He's worrying about the offense. It'll take care of itself. We are, as we've talked ad infinitum, we are scoring well enough. That's not an issue. But he's reminding the competition that we've got the best defense and you've got to find a way through it. Everyone is thinking Pies is the template to beat. And again, it hasn't. You don't copy something that hasn't won anything. I'll remind everyone that the Cats won it last year using our methodology. So in terms of the weaknesses that I think other teams have exploited is because of, one of the things that I thought Port did really well and Freo did really well, and it took us a little time to adjust. It felt like at the ground was kicks to free players up on the 40, 50 metre line by themselves and pulling us apart that way. That's all about trying to pull apart our defensive structure down back, that triangle, to separate them out. And you've got your pillars, your three talls generally. And we gave up goals to Port, and both of those games early on, we gave up goals off that half-forward flank. Melbourne, again, a lot of it is analytics. We will give leads to the pocket, for instance, because, you're not as likely to score from 40 metres out from the, pockets. But I wonder whether that data is changing a little bit because so many players these days can cover 50, 60 metres with a kick. So, players like Houston, for instance, for Port, he's a phenomenal kick. And, if you get him the ball on the half-forward flank, anywhere around the arc, he's got a good chance. So that was one thing. I thought in both games we adjusted really well. For me, the big thing that worried me against Essendon was how how much trouble we had with their tools when they pushed both Francis and
Draper.
Right, Draper.
Back when, and 3 metre Peter wasn't even playing in that game. We really struggled.
Max wasn't as well, was he?
Max wasn't playing, and that was the game. Lever went out late,
that
and we
was the
brought
game,
Tomlinson.
Lever, that's right.
So we were still playing with only the two key position
two tall backs. Yeah,
and as George noted, we're coming off a 6-day break,
and it was
that
wet
means
that day as well.
Fatigue, as I've said a number of times, is for us and Collingwood in particular. Fatigue impacts us more than anyone. And one of the really interesting things I think that Goody's done this year that he didn't do last year is I think part of the adjustment to our game plan at the moment and hyper focusing on defence. As I've mentioned last week, is part of a strategy to not spend as much pennies. Last year we didn't. We kept on playing this sort of intensive game. Teams started coming at us more, and we couldn't go with them. I feel like that we're, one of the advantages of playing so defensively and not allowing the game to become a running match, like against the Blues or the Pies, not getting into a running race, is you use less. Power. You don't need as much aerobic fitness. So I think it's quite clever in that sense. We'll get faster. We'll absolutely get faster.
Red and Blue Rising says, being third on the ladder is a great start, and the notion that we are building to playing our best football at the back end of the year is excellent. What has to click in order for us to play our best, and is our best the best? D-Zone says, we've attended all home games to date, and although we've had some convincing wins, others have been less so. The Pies win was exhilarating, but we seem to have been holding back at times. Where are we going to find that extra improvement that will enable us to win the prize? So, George, the competition has changed this season, the way sides are playing as opposed to last year. What perhaps do we need to do anything to change or to alter anything or to improve on the way that we're currently playing? Like, what has to click, as Red and Blue Rising asks?
I'll keep it simple. It's been the problem the last 3 weeks. Kicks straight from set shots. and we won't even have to talk about much else. But, in all honesty, we're playing very, very well at the moment. We're sitting third on the ladder with a good percentage. We've had some significant players missing for long periods of time during the season. In Gawn and Oliver and Petty, in particular, there's probably three of your top 10 players on the field at least, and we've overcome those deficiencies. We're playing good football at the moment, but I know all the fans want to see 20-goal wins and 100 points plus every game, but it's not going to happen. But we're doing exactly what we need to do at the moment to achieve our results, and we don't need to be going, as Bin Man just noted, we don't need to be running furiously at this point in the season. We'll save ourselves for the second half of the season. Hopefully those injuries don't occur again, which will challenge us the same as they'll challenge any other side. But kicking straight wins matches, as simple as that. We haven't lost the matches at the moment, but we only got half of our set shots in the last 3 weeks. The games would have been won by 5, 6, and maybe even more goals.
And just on that comment from Stu, I think that's really interesting. We're definitely, I talked last year about our forward handballs that we were doing. That's become standard in the AFL, now, of those long clearing handballs to clear that congestion that George was talking, to get it outside the ring. But I think an advantage that we've got tactically is last year, as I said, everyone was coming at us. Everyone was coming at us to beat our model. Again, I'll remind people that Geelong copied our model. They won the flag. So it's still a fairly effective model. But the advantage we've got this year is we're putting tactical time that we weren't so much last year into, for instance, stopping Collingwood by, pushing up on them, that blueprint stuff. We've, tactically, one of the changes that we've done, but we did this last year a lot, is own the corridor, really flood the corridor. George noted last week we allowed Pies the wings. You give up the wings if you're going to take the corridor. But we also tactically, made it difficult for them to feed the ball out to Dacos. I'm guessing there was some of that last year, but we were the ones being hunted last year, and we've engineered a scenario where we can be the hunter, against the team that as I've said, a good side Collingwood, but yet to really win anything, not even a night grand final, you might, in years gone past. So I think it's quite clever by Goody. He's not, he's allowing that media narrative to be used to our advantage, and he's going to work on how to make it difficult for Collingwood to play while still playing our game. And, Goody's a huge one for this, and so is McRae, actually. I heard him talk about, they want to play a particular way. We want to play a particular way. It's got a bit of an echo, actually, into the Ashes at the moment, the Bazball versus the more traditional model, which is, whose system, whose way of playing is, going to prevail. And a big thing for Goody, big thing for any team, but particularly Goody's philosophy is make the game look like a Melbourne game. And so a lot of his tactics is to force it back to we want to play, like Stu said, play fast. Is the only way to beat us. Play slow, you won't beat Melbourne. You just can't. But, we're getting better at stopping even fast teams, being as fast. And we had practice with the Dogs with that, and now we're going to work on the Pies as well.
Singer asks, wondering who the panel thinks will be our biggest threats for the flag this year. It's looking likely that the Pies, Port and Brisbane will be top four given the Pies' current record and Port and Brizzy's home ground advantages. Are any of the teams currently, at time of writing, in the bottom part of the 8 a threat for our flag? Yes, our flag. Currently Saints, Bombers, Adelaide and Dogs. What about the teams currently sitting outside the 8? Currently Cats, Dockers, Suns and perhaps the Tigers. Any concerns from these sides? Excellent podcast. As always, fellas, keep punching them out. Go Demons. So each of us are going to briefly go through the other current top 4 sides. B-Man's going to take his favourites, Collingwood. I'll take Port, and George will talk the Lions. We can then give our take on the other top 8 teams and those on the cusp of the 8. So B-Man, we should have given the Pies a hiding on King's birthday, but for our inaccuracy that George talked about, well, that almost cost us an unlosable match from the position we were in. From what you've seen this year, are the Pies, and I'll guess they're not, are they a threat to us in September?
Absolutely, they're a threat. Of course they're a threat. And I'll go back to George's comments about, everything has to go right. Whoever wins the flag, when they look back, it'll be everything went right. Like we talked about it, everything went so right for the Cats, didn't they? But we're not immune to it. Everything that could go right for us in 21 went right for us. Everything that could go wrong last year didn't. And it was we talked about that notion of one more grain of sand tipped it over, into the we can't win stage. So, luck plays a huge part of that. You get some critical injuries at the end of the season. I know that, my point about the Pies isn't that they're not a good team. They're an excellent team. They're well coached. They've got excellent players. I was really impressed with some of their in-tight handball skills, their ability to block. They've got some really high-level skills like that they've clearly been working on. They've got a particular philosophy that's exciting to watch because it involves that wave running. But I think they've got a vulnerability strategically. So of course they can win the flag. They're definitely one of the top four chances. I think that the challenge for the Pies, though, is, I won't back away from the fact that I think that they're massively overrated, and that's on the back of them not having achieved anything. And so, again, as I raved about last week, their record in big games if you go back to the beginning of the finals last year isn't very impressive. They lost 2 of 3 finals last year. They just got beaten by the D's, a top 4 contender. They won against Port, but they also got rolled by the Lions. So of the legitimate contenders, they're no better than us, 1 and 2 against the top 4 teams. I think one of the challenges for Collingwood is exactly what I was just touching on, is that teams now opposition teams have gone to school on them, have had a full last year and all of this season to look at what they're doing tactically and work out ways to address it. I'll bet you my bottom dollar, some of the things that we did in the Pies game last week, tactically we'll look to do again. Why not? We'll definitely look to own the corridor. Absolutely. We'll definitely look to make sure we're up in their grills and, frontal pressure. So we're giving them no time and space to operate in. But I'll bet you there'll be, maybe they'll use Fritter again on more, but I'm guessing they probably won't, that they'll have, definitely they will have kept their tactical powder dry. Of course I rate Collingwood. I would have them, is equal second. If I was framing a market right before the Pies game, I would have had us at $5 to win the flag, so 4-1 in the old, 25%. I would have had the Pies second, and with the Lions equal, both on $5.50, and Port out at $7. That's how I would have framed the market. It hasn't changed. My odds haven't changed on any. I'd probably wind Port in a little bit, maybe equal with the Pies. So I think that my point being is that they're a legitimate contender, an excellent side, but as I talked at length about last week, they've got some specific vulnerabilities, I think, that will get exposed. Now, one of the big challenges, and I think this is a massive, massive challenge for them, is their run home. So they're coming off the bye as well. Unlike us, they get a full 10-day break or 14-day break. So they played us last Monday, obviously. Their next game is not till this Sunday, where they play the Crows at the G. Nice Sunday Arvo game for them. So they'll be well and truly rested for that.
I don't know why our game, sorry to interrupt you, why aren't we playing Geelong on Saturday night? We've got to have a talk with the AFL about this next year. It's
insane. It's ridiculous. That's a whole nother show.
Yeah. There's probably no lights down at Cardinia Park or something.
Well, that's probably
Taxpayer Park have got a Thursday night.
No, they play night games there at the moment. But anyway, we're playing them on the night time this week on Thursday.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, there's any number of fixturing anomalies, and that's a huge one because I've got a conspiracy theory about all of that, but I haven't got time to go into it. Well, my short version is, it goes to the loading question, is that, there's absolutely no question it happens. Where would the benefit be in rolling 5 buys in a row? Is because you get upsets. The AFL want upsets. Brisbane don't beat Hawthorn if there's one bye and the whole AFL takes off the that one bye. Freo don't lose the way they lost to the Giants on the weekend if there's one bye, because everyone has that break at the same time. That means everyone's training programs, the contenders, are all in sync. So they're all going to play at the same time. But the way it rolls at the moment, with all teams having spread out over bye, is their training and their loading programs are all out of sync. That means a Freo suddenly comes up against the Giants and they are completely and utterly gassed. I don't know if you saw any of that game. They could not run.
Yeah, well, keep that for later when you talk to loading, because I want you to have examples.
And so the Pies then have got, so their run home is the Crows. And then they've got a 6-day break into the Suns up at Queensland. So that's a 4:35 twilight game. That's going to be slippery tough and a really physically tough game. They then got a 6-day break flying back to Melbourne. They play the Dogs at Marvel Stadium. They then play Dockers on another 6-day break. So they've got a 7-day break into the Dockers at the G. Then they travel to Port Adelaide. A week's break, Port Adelaide, Collingwood at Adelaide Oval. They play the Blues, which, even though the Blues aren't, maybe they'll be doing better than, but that's an 80,000 crowd, big emotional game. Yeah. They Hawthorn, who are, that's probably their weakest. Then they've got their second to last games, Collingwood, the Cats.
Okay. Yeah.
The third last game, then they play the Lions, and they travel, at the G. Then they finish the season against Essendon, which will be another 80,000.
They got a really tough run home.
That is a really tough run home. And the big thing to note, though, is those big games, like the Blues. Even if the Blues might be playing for 8th, the Bombers almost certainly will be playing for a position in the finals. They'll be critical games with 80 to 90,000 people there going bananas. And so emotionally and physically, they're going to be super tough games. That is a really, really tough run home. And if they come through the end of that, still, I predict they'll struggle to go, 60-40 in that period. Okay. Some of those are really tough games. And so, that's why I'm bullish that they'll still drop down the ladder. And if they do, it comes into play playing Brisbane or Port away in that first week of the final. Same for us as well, obviously. It's just that we've got a much better run. I don't think we'll win this week. I'll put it this way: I'm surprised if we win. That's a bonus. But then there's not another game for the rest of the season we won't go into as favourite. We will be favourite for the rest of the season, and I haven't checked the odds for this game, but I
believe they were favourites, I think, until maybe they lost this week and our win against.
And with Thingo, so it's if we go into this game favourites, we will be favourite for every single game we play for the rest of the season, and that's a good run home, and a tough run home for the Pies.
Okay, Andy, tell us why Port are going
we're $1.85 and Geelong are $2. Gamble responsibly.
We will not start a game for the rest of the season, the home and away season, and not be favourite.
So Port Adelaide, I do see Port as a big threat to us, and I know we lost by only 4 points to them a few weeks ago in Adelaide in the torrential rain. In that match, we probably should have been down by a lot more in the first half, but due to their inaccuracy, and then we're only 14 points down at halftime. We had that superb 7-goal third term. It allowed us to grab the lead by 3 goals. And then they had a late goal that saw us up by only 11 at three-quarter time. And then there was that sort of insipid last quarter and, saw the Ds and the umpires had a bit of sway in that game, and the Power snatched victory by 4 points. Now, the Power, they boast a talented, well-balanced squad. They have a mix of experienced players and rising stars that provide them, depth and versatility across all positions. They've got players like Ollie Wines, Travis Boak, and Captain Tom Jonas, who surprisingly can't get a game at the moment. They bring the leadership and experience. And then they've got the emerging talent such as Connor Rozee, Zach Butters, and Jason Horn-Francis that add that youthful energy in the engine room. And it's this midfield trio that are very close to being the heir apparent to our midfield crown. They're formidable midfield units, very capable of dominating games. They've got very big strength of winning clearances, contested possession, and most importantly, I always like with the midfielders, they're able to all apply some scoreboard pressure. They're the highest scoring team this season. Their forward line boasts a lot of tall talent. Jeremy Finlayson, I'm a big fan of. Todd Marshall, Charlie Dixon, they're all still capable of kicking bags of goals. Sam Powell-Pepper and Junior Rioli, very dangerous once the ball hits the deck. Defence is where I'm not too keen on them. Ali is a top interceptor, but Port have had the most, and you'll might be surprised at it, they've had the most scores kicked against them this season of the current top 10 teams. They've also played that one extra game, but it's not far off of being one of the worst records of the top 10 teams. They enjoy that significant home ground advantage that we talked about with their passionate and vocal support of their home crowd, which creates that intimidating atmosphere for visiting teams and umpires alike. And their remaining 9 games, they play 4 at home, excluding the showdown clash against the Crows. So they've got 5 games at home. But they also have a game at the Cattery and a game in Perth against Fremantle to come as well. I believe they're going to finish top 2. Our loss to them a few weeks ago was a true 8-point game, and I can't see us overtaking them in the run home. So a trip to Adelaide Oval for us in the first week of finals is in play. I'd prefer to play them in a qualifying final in Adelaide rather than a preliminary final there. But having said that, I would love to get a crack at them at the G on grand final day. But let's not get ahead of ourselves there. So that's Port. George, you got Brisbane. They've beaten us in our last 2 outings against them, including knocking us out of last year's final series. They currently sit 4th behind us on percentage. How big a threat are the Lions?
The Lions are a big threat because they've already got enough wins on the board. For a start off, I've got no doubt they'll finish top 4. Whether they can get to top 2 is their problem, and their other big and major problem that we've talked about before was, can they win away from the Gabba?
They've won one game at the G.
One game against Carlton.
No.
Sorry.
Who was the team that they've beaten at the MCG? You said Carlton?
Us.
It's us.
Yeah. So can they win away from the Gabba is their biggest problem. I think Binman talked last week about the conditions that they play in, and I think they play a lot of night games as well, which also suits the conditions where the ball is slippery. It suits their style of play, but as soon as as soon as the opposition play in better conditions, where ball handling is critical about the way you kick and handball and things like that, they seem to falter really badly. They're dependent on the opposition fumbling the ball, which is great. It's a nice game plan to have because it suits your particular home ground advantage. But as proven this year, as soon as they move away from that, they really, really struggle. Now, they've certainly bolstered their team from last year, and this is why I thought they would rise to be genuine challengers this year, was the addition of Dunkley and Ashcroft into their midfield has made a real difference. Instead of depending on people like Robinson last year to be part of the midfield, they've now got talent in there, which is a great improvement. Their injuries are minimal at the moment, which is the perfect position to be in at this point in the season. Their back line doesn't seem to have the same sort of structures as ours has. They are utterly dependent on the skills of Harris in particular, being able to intercept ball when they struggled when Payne was injured, and they're using Darcy Ford as the third tall defender, but he's also their backup ruck. So their back line's a little bit vulnerable. If there are injuries to any of those, they will struggle big time because teams will start to score heavily against them. The other thing that's happened only just in the last week or two was what's happening with Daniel Rich. Last year, he was a serious threat for any other opposition sides. You just did not let the ball get in his hands. Seems to have dropped off dramatically this year, but given his age, that's what I was talking about before, the cliff hits very quickly for some players. Just as equally, Kitty Coleman has turned out to be a magnificent replacement for him. He is absolutely into everything.
I love him as a player.
Oh yeah, he is just brilliant. So I think they've lost Rich, but they've picked up Kitty as a replacement. Their forwards are flaky at the very best description I can find for them. Danaher and Hipwood, if they get their first couple of kicks in, they're absolute world beaters. They go from one goal to five very quickly, either of them. They miss the first couple, they go to water completely. And in our case, they're easily covered by May and Lever when we have a full strength side available. And really, their other forward is Charlie Cameron. If you stop Charlie, you really do stop Brisbane. And the way he plays requires a sort of player who just simply sticks to him. Yeah. You do not let him get out the back. He's not all that well when he has to move up the field. He's not that challenging. You let him out the back. He's exactly like Jeff Garlett used to be for us. You might as well put the score on the board already. So. They've got for Brisbane. They've only got 4 more away games. I'm not counting the Suns game, so that sort of means that they're going to finish with 6 more wins, and that'll make them 19. I don't know that that's going to be enough for them to get top 2. It's going to be a bit of a squeeze at that point. We've got a better percentage than what they have at the moment, which I think
13% almost a game, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And that's going to probably be the difference between second and third, and that's going to mean the difference about where you play your home final. So that's going to be interesting come the end of the round 22-23 situation.
Yeah, that's a great assessment of where they're at. It's funny, George, you mentioned about the Gabba, because I wrote on Demonland during the week that I really reckon it's a double-edged sword for them, because their record up there is ridiculous. It's something like, I forget the number, it's something like 65-5 or something nuts over the last sort of 7-8 years or something. It's phenomenal. It's a huge leg up. It's a massive advantage for them because it almost guarantees them finals. Just about guarantees them finals if with their home game wins. But the thrust of my post was exactly what you said, is that whether they've done it consciously or unconsciously, why I say it's a double-edged sword is because they've built this meat and potatoes game that works super well in the slippery conditions when it's night, in particular when it's night, because they always get those slippery up at the Gabba. Lots of heavy contests, lots of ball on the deck. The last game they played was a classic example of it. It just became a slog. And when it came a slog, their players, all of their physically strong players like Rich, even though, you caught up with the fact that he's put himself out for a while. Did you hear that?
Yeah, him and Gunston.
Yeah. So that because all of those players come to the fore, but the reason, why it's a double-edged sword is because that it's not the issue that they don't travel. The issue is they then play on normal-sized footy grounds outside of the Gabba, and they're just too slow. They haven't got the leg speed. That's number one. Number two, they've still got this old-school meat and potatoes mid 2000s game style, no defensive sort of grid, no modern zone that gets exposed, on grounds with space where teams can really expose their lack of leg speed. And once they transition quick, they've got no real ability to set up behind the ball properly the way Melbourne do. So it's a massive, massive problem for them. And it's a catch-22 because the Gabba gives them, a shot at top four every year, just like it will this year. I just don't think that game style is modern and it's not going to win them a flag. However, why I think that they're as big a threat as Collingwood is if they can get a final up at the Gabba, because they win that one, then the next one's at the Gabba. I know that the grand finals are not at the Gabba, but let's say the grand final's wet. It brings them right into it. When it becomes a slog, they've got a whole system and a list that's been developed to win slogs, to win physical contests. We do all right against them just because we're so physically strong, but they're going to win. Doesn't matter who they play up there, they're going to go in as favourite, as I mentioned before, up at the Gabba. So they're always a threat if they can get first home final at the Gabba.
Ross Million asks, do you think the current top four are the teams in contention and will remain unchanged? I think we've all answered that question, and it's a yes. How important is a top two finish considering Port and Brisbane will be tough road trips in finals? And I'm not convinced we can catch either Collingwood or Port and clinch a top two berth. George, is finishing top two imperative? Will a top four spot and the double chance suffice, or are you up for the challenge of an interstate trip in the first week of finals?
I think there's no doubt from the results in the previous couple of years that top two enables you, firstly, to get a rest of some sort, and a home finals. Again, you don't have to travel. I don't care what anybody thinks. Even the 42-minute flight to Adelaide is a couple of hours or half a day out of your life, even to get there and then get back. So if Port and Brisbane finish top two, they are in a seriously good position for further advancement this year. So top four, again, it's just the statistics of previous winners. You've almost got to finish top four to have any chance whatsoever, but top two really makes it for you. I can't see much change at this point in the season. Essendon's on the same number of points as us, if I remember.
No, we're a game ahead.
Yeah, sorry, a game ahead. Okay. But really, given our run, I think we're going to deny other teams beneath us. We've reached the point in the season, the AFL fixture, it's a very good name for it, makes the top teams from last year play off against each other very early in the season as a general rule. So if by halfway you're sitting at the top of the ladder, as we are, all of a sudden the midfield teams finish up playing each other and knocking each other out. So there's not much of a change occurs, except probably in the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sort of positions, but the top four generally doesn't change all that much.
And there's a gap, isn't there, between part of it is a bit of shimmerer because St Kilda, they generate exactly as you say, they really went as much as they can to maximise the likelihood St Kilda and Essendon were going to have some wins on the board, and that's a real advantage to get the momentum, isn't it? But St Kilda been found out a little bit. I reckon there's every chance, Andy, that we'll finish top 1 or 2, maybe not 1 but 2, because we play Brisbane. We win that game, then we get 4 points closer to them. As I said, we've got a really relatively soft draw home. Collingwood have got a relatively tough draw. Collingwood play Port. So one of those teams is going to, end up having to drop 4 points, obviously. So that gives us that opportunity to get, we're only 2 games behind.
Yeah, we're two behind. So we've got to catch up.
Yeah, and then the week after they play Collingwood, Port, that is, they go down to the Cattery and play Geelong. So even, Geelong, I still think will come good despite their poor effort last week. They'll win their share of games and they'll win 80% of their games. That's number one in the AFL, I reckon, has to be the Gabba in terms of home ground advantage. But number 2 must be pretty close to being Geelong, you'd think, wouldn't it? So, there's a couple of tough games right there. Collingwood, albeit at Port Adelaide, at Adelaide Oval, and then buttering up the next week. I think it's the next week or within a couple of weeks. Port have to go down Geelong. So every chance of skipping over the top, particularly because we've got 15 or 16% more than Port do. It's going to be a big factor. So, as I said, that's like a game in hand. If we end up on the same points, we'll finish above them.
The other top 8 teams. So briefly, guys, which of the current remaining top 8 teams that we haven't talked about, St Kilda, Essendon, Western Bulldogs and Adelaide, do you think any of them can be a threat? And which ones might fail to make the 8? George, any of those teams a threat to you?
No, I don't. Essendon's the only one at the moment.
I'm a bit worried about them.
They're running on momentum and hope more than anything else. They caught us at a good time. I don't think they're going to have that luck in the second half of the season. I can't see anybody else. Like I said, there'll be some minor changes around the 6, 7, 8 mark, but I don't see any other real challenges coming for us. Like I said, St Kilda also suddenly has to play other players, other teams around about that mark, so I don't think they're going to go anywhere as well.
I wish I'd chosen Adelaide as the boulder because I don't think to win a flag, because I just don't think, it's just too hard, isn't it, outside the top 4 to win a flag. It can happen, but, it's probably not going to happen this year because there is a gap between those top 4 teams and the next one's down. But Adelaide play a very, exciting brand of footy. For me, Adelaide are really interesting if strategically they've taken big elements of the Pies game of moving it really quick off the halfback flank and combined it with an approach of Burgess's fitness and that psychologically we can outrun teams. That's their mantra. We're the fittest team, even though everyone says Collingwood is. The Crows say they are, but also they've got quite a powerful forward line and a better defense, not quite the same as sort of sophisticated defense as us. So they're going to cause some damage on the way home, and they play Port at Adelaide Oval in a derby late in the season. That's going to be a corker of a game, and they're a good team on their day. Adelaide, play a brand of footy and have got the talent across the board to beat anyone, I reckon, including us if everything goes right on the day and they kick straight and we don't. So that's another challenging game for Port, and I could see them, making a push, towards the top 4, not making top 4. They're too far back, but the Dogs and the Crows are the two best teams outside the top 4.
And it's Adelaide's home game against Port, so perhaps their crowd will get the umpires on their side. Anyone to fall out of there? I reckon St Kilda could fall out.
I reckon. I reckon.
All right, so
they've done amazingly well. We've got to give credit to St Kilda, but they've done it on the back of a system. Really, that's what they've done. They've put in a system, and Lyon has created his players. Got them super fit as well. It's all about fitness at that top level.
He's put in a defensive system which was non-existent before, and I think they're the lowest in the 8. I think they've got the lowest points against, which is indicative of that. They've got a lot of other areas to pick up on in particular, but it'll put them in good stead for years to come. Whether they're going to get any further. With the talent they've got, I don't know. I think, but certainly the defensive structures they've got are much needed.
Yeah, and one thing, just quick, Andy. One thing I meant to say about Melbourne and Port, and what I really like about the Lions too, is I'm loving it AFL wide, is young players coming in and making a real impact. And Brisbane, That Fletcher kid,
He looked good, yeah.
He looks like he's got skills. And Ashcroft is just a gun, a total gun. And there's another young player, a little slight fellow, number 11, I think, or he was only his third or fourth game. And that's what they need. Brisbane need that injection of young players and quick, but that's what Port have got in spades. So, and, one thing about Melbourne under Goody that could easily get under our guard is how proactive he's been at getting young players in the side. Look how many young under 22 players we've got in our current lineup. It's Cozzy, McVee, Spargs probably now over that.
Chandler.
But, JVR, that's last year, obviously, Jacko. He has been at the forefront of putting younger players in. And now, you got right across the AFL, young players are really having an amazing impact on footy.
All right, just quickly, any teams that are currently outside the 8 that you reckon might pinch a finals berth? We've got Richmond, Geelong, GWS, Gold Coast, Fremantle, maybe Carlton, probably not, hopefully not. Any one of those? Geelong, probably.
Geelong, maybe.
Geelong, maybe, yeah.
Might care value on that.
Yeah.
That'll be the narrative for others. How great it is that Melbourne aren't in that conversation. All my following of all the years following Melbourne, that's been, maybe we can make the 8.
All right. Now we've talked loading to death, but 640MD has a question and he asks, are we loading this year? Were we loading last year? Does every side do a similar loading pattern? If they do, doesn't that make it all equal? Does it work? So before you answer this, B-Man, as you are the expert on loading on this podcast anyway, can you give us a brief primer on what loading is and what the benefits of loading mid-season is supposed to achieve? Then you can answer 640MD's question on loading and if every team does it, doesn't it all equal out? And since you watch, as we said, a lot of non-Ds games, perhaps you can talk about some of the other teams' recent form, which might indicate that they too are in a loading period that might account for their form. That is, if you have examples, and I know you do because you were talking about Freo before.
Well, I'll try not to bore everyone.
We don't have to go too long into the loading thing. We've heard it. For anyone new listening, just give a brief sort of.
Yeah, no worries. So the analogy of that I've used not this year but previous years is the idea of an Olympic event. And let's say it's in the 12 month before the Olympic event and you're a swimmer and your goal is to be in peak optimal fitness come the very date of the gold medal race. Let's call it an 800 or 1,500 metre race, swimming race. You need to plan out that full 12 months or longer, obviously, but 12 months, let's say, ahead of that event to be in the optimal shape. And it's much easier to do with a single athlete. It's a huge challenge to do with a big group of players. So this idea of sort of doing additional blocks of training. So in that example, in that analogy of the swimming event, they might have a series of events through the year, like the selection carnival, to get selected into the side. So they've got to be pretty close to their optimal fitness to actually get in the side. In order to do that, they've got to do a big block of physical, of aerobic training and power training. And in footy sense, that's the January and February period. In order for that swimmer to be cherry ripe for the Australian champs, to get selected, they have to be pretty close to their optimal level of their Olympic level to get the times. Then they go on and a series of events through the year. They're still swimming, so they still have to remain fit, but they can't keep. They have to, because they keep swimming right through. Their fitness slowly erodes, and that's what happens in footy, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. They have this accumulative fatigue as the season goes on, but as the Olympic final comes closer, they need to go through another period of additional training, aerobic and power to peak again. So a second peak. And then they taper off and get cherry ripe for the final. So in the football sense, January, February, they train super, super hard. They put down their foundation for their entire fitness for the full year. Selwyn Griffith talked about that eroding. So accumulative fatigue once the season starts, they're at their fittest. They're going to be all season, round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4, and it progressively loses that fitness and aerobic edge and no doubt sort of niggles and injuries and power drops. come the middle of the season, as was discussed before, only 70% of maintaining their fitness can happen during the game. So they have to use the time between the two matches to at least keep them up, but they can't get ahead of the curve. They've got to put fuel in the tank. And this is the big sort of, I guess, debate. There was a couple of years ago when we first started talking about this on the podcast and on Demonland. A lot of people just rejected the idea that it was happening at all. I think it's accepted now. The probably debate is, well, how long does it happen for? My best guess is a 2 or 3 week, probably closer to a 3 week period of they call it a V, so an increased period of aerobic loading. So it's probably loading is the probably wrong word, but increased load. So even Goody today was talking about the load that Clary has to pick up on that he's lost in hospital. And they also combine additional running. So you heard me talk about Kev Martin's report ahead the Tuesday morning that before our podcast ahead of the Pies game. He said that they did a huge amount of running, more running than he'd seen all season. That will have been part of it. They also then have to do increase weights and power. So someone like Track is a power athlete, someone like Nibbler is a runner. He's an aerobic athlete. So they'll have each player will have a slightly different program, all with the goal, as Goody keeps talking about, to being in our optimal shape come finals. The big query is what impact it has on its performance. So going back to, and how long. So, the 9-day break is a problem. Selwyn Griffiths said it's a problem because it creates, where do you structure your 3-week period around? When they've got the problem with the break, I think, of not having of the full 14 days is you can't really give the players the opportunity to take time out and chill and mentally refresh. I mean, they went away for 4 days. They were back on the Saturday. And whereas the Pies had that whole weekend just gone and they were back on deck this morning, so someone like JBR, there's no way he could have gone home and come back in time, whereas if the equivalent player for the Pies could have. So that's a big challenge for us psychologically. Selwyn Griffith talked about that. It's a really good interview, so it's worth hearing that, mentally refreshing, but maybe there's some benefits in that model, if leaving aside the mental, and I think they're structuring around these 9-day breaks. So my best guess is that they were doing extra additional work on top of their normal training routine. In addition to that, they do extra running, extra power, extra weights, and that, of course, fatigues them. And so they're fatigued coming into the Freo game. I think they'd started then. Who knows? That's where it's guesswork. I know that loading happens. The rest is guesswork. But definitely ahead of the Pies game, I think, as well, because of the 9-day break, taper a little bit into the Pies game. I think they will go hard this week, which is why I think that I will be very happy if we win. I don't expect us to beat the Cats. I think we'll have a scrappy, physical game, with a view to being the Ferrari later in the season. So that's the big query, is the impact of it. Now, the question that is a good one that came up last year and the year before is, well, if everyone's doing it, does everyone do it? And I say the answer is yes, but the difference is the top 4 contenders need to be fitter 3 weeks later. The teams that are just pushing for the 8 need to be optimal come finals. And that's a fairly big period of time, a month out. So they're not. So I think they're all on different programs, but the contenders would be on almost, the same outcome they're looking for, slightly different programs. Geelong said, almost as a statement of fact, Scott said last year that they copied Melbourne's program wholly and solely. And from the point that their bye period, I think they were 7-4, they barely lost a game after that and got stronger and stronger and stronger through the season. And they credit their fitness and their strength. And it's not just aerobic power, it's physical strength to win the contest. So the question is how much it has an impact on a result. And the example that I wanted to give is the game against Freo. I don't know, did either of you guys watch any of Freo's game?
Freo GWS, yeah. Freo looked like they were running in concrete boots.
Yeah, they like. So I wrote about that in terms of it's a good one because it's not emotive like Melbourne, right? So who cares about Freo? I was watching it because I'm loving watching Freo get beaten. It's fantastic. But so I wrote on Demonland, that they were super fatigued. There's no question. They had no run in their legs at all, and so hence they had no overlap run. They couldn't get any overlap run. They couldn't get any spread. They couldn't cover outlets, kicks, or slow the transition. And you will have seen the footage of it. The goal the Giants kicked in the last second second or third was a perfect example of what I meant. They could not stop that ball transitioning from one end of the ground to the other. And there's no question in my mind they're in the middle of, or they've just completed a really heavy block of aerobic conditioning, and because they had no run in their legs at all. Now, as I've talked about, I'm a punter. What was weird about that game is that the Giants were short price favourites to come into that game. I know it was at home, but the Giants don't have any home ground advantage, and Freo were on the up. And I suspect more and more, the punters, the clever dollars, they know when this is happening, because that was a really anomalous. And there was another really anomalous one, which was the Tigers went into that Saints game short price favourite, despite the fact that the Saints are in the top 8 and the Tigers weren't. So the same thing, the Saints ran out of puff. And I note about Freo's a really good example, because we've been in the same boat the last 3 seasons, including this season. So we come into matches fatigued. We were fatigued. I thought was fantastic, our effort against Pies, but definitely against Freo, maybe less so Port, I'm not sure. But fatigue's been a massive factor in our surprising mid-season losses. Last year when we got beaten by Collingwood, for instance, the previous year when we won the flag, exactly the same pattern is emerging. This year has been even better, for an example. So you had Hawthorn flogging Brisbane. It's exactly the same as the Freo. They had no run in their legs, Brisbane, because they're going through this heavy training phase. What the real positive thing, though, to take from it from a Melbourne perspective is there's no question that fatigue has been a factor, but we have never folded like Freo did. Never, not once. All of our losses have been close in this middle of the season period when fatigue is, you've got your cumulative fatigue for the first 10 games intersecting, smashing right into their additional training they're doing on top of being already exhausted. They're exhausted having played 6, they started training in January, in middle of June. They have not stopped. And so they've got all of that accumulative fatigue. And in addition, Selwyn Griffiths is pushing them beyond that limit. We have been able to minimise our losses and only lose by a couple of goals. We have had no results, nothing close to that blowout that Hawthorn put on Brisbane or the Giants put on Freo. For me, that's a massive, massive, massive red flag, five alarm bell ringing for Freo, because that is an attitude and mindset. Because there is a legitimate question as well, what does that mean? That puts your season at risk. But that's that whole, you're preparing now to win the flag. Listen to what Goody's saying. That's all about to win the flag. Doesn't matter if you lose against Collingwood in the middle of June in winter. It doesn't matter. It may have an impact on where you finish on the ladder, but it's a calculated risk. Remember, Scott said last year when asked about the risk of them going hard at the mid-season, do you remember his quote? He said that, it was a bit rich, but he said, we are prepared to miss the 8 if it increases our chances of being competitive to win a flag. And what he was saying is we cannot beat Melbourne unless we are as fit as them. And they ultimately won the flag on the back of their fitness and strength. They were too fit for the Swans. They just smashed them. And they were too good for the Pies in that game. So, do other teams do it? Yes, they do. I think that, there's so many results. You just go look in the last 3 weeks. If you're tipping, they're all out of whack. There is no way to explain what happened against Freo Giants game without factoring in fatigue. And then just the final thing on it is that it's so frustrating because the media don't. I heard them, the media do not credit it. And so where I get really frustrated about it is because if you're going to analyse a game and think about, well, what are the factors that say, just take that Freo game and don't factor in fatigue, then the only thing that's left is they're mentally weak. Oh, Freo.
Gary Lyon, after the game, sort of mentioned that maybe the bye, something about the bye, them coming back from the bye a week or two before was the reason why. And I was going to ask you, why don't, if loading is a thing, and I'm not doubting that it is, I think there's a lot of merit to it, but why isn't the media all over this?
Well, here's where my conspiracy theory in. Well, why? So think of Occam's razor. Why wouldn't they be?
I don't know.
Because the Giants, you don't want to go into a match and go explain. Sorry, George. The Giants is that you want every week's this contender or a pretender. Every game's this theatre. And Channel 7 don't want that. Fox don't want that. Fox don't want to say, oh, well, actually, Freo haven't really they're not going to perform that well this week against this team because we know that they're loading super hard. Don't worry about money. You'll hear people say it's about punting. It's absolutely loaded bollocks. It's got nothing to do with the punters. The serious punters know it. So they don't need it. All the other clubs know it as well. All the other clubs would know intimately where every other club is with their fitness. So I'll bet you Selwyn Griffith is completely all over the Pies fitness regime and would know to a minute where they are on their cycle and their planning and when they're going to be fatigued and all of that. I think the media don't want. That's why it's not discussed. Because people say, last year, people would get cranky about it, saying, "Well, I don't want to follow footy if it's all about fitness." And I think it's purely that.
I think it's even simpler than that, Ben Man. You've only got to look at the people who are providing the media commentary and how much exercise they would or preparation for football they did 25 years ago.
Yeah. Different.
There was non-existent any of this. Brian Taylor wouldn't know, and neither would Gary Lyon know about running extra weights even. It just didn't exist in those days, so that they don't know anything about it. So
and it's funny because both Fox and Seven are using current players a lot more now, and they are almost saying it. Jobe Watson mentioned it a couple of months ago in that Geelong when we played. Essendon talked about fatigue. Fatigue is now becoming the word. So fatigue is the new loading word. Just on that, George, I had to laugh. It just made me crack up. Exactly on that. Isaac Smith was in the commentary box on Fox, or maybe it was on the radio on SEN, and they were talking about they were interviewing a player. So, well, why weren't you at the club? He was doing they all had to do umpiring or something. Why weren't you at the club doing recovery? And Isaac Smith laughed at him and said, Derm, we don't do recovery at the club anymore after a game.
Yeah.
It's like, back in the day, they probably had to get them all because they were out at the nightclub getting hammered and put them in an ice bath or go down the thingo. It's not, Isaac Smith basically laughed at him and said, we don't do that anymore. Like that, maybe 20 years ago, 25, maybe. So, that's definitely a factor. But I just think they don't like the theatre, but it'll change in the next couple of years. Yeah, and for me, it makes it more interesting. It makes it, like then you go, well, wow, if we're fatigued and still won. Geelong won a couple of games last year where it was just mental strength where they willed their way through it. We stayed in games with our system and mental strength. Freo folded. So did Brisbane. They got hammered by the Hawks. I mean, it's easy to forget. Brisbane got carved up on the MCG.
They also looked like they were running in concrete boots on that.
They were running in concrete boots, and you can see it. You don't need to, because it's such a running game now, you can see it's not like it was 4 or 5 years ago where it was a bit hard to tell. Now it's so running. It's like we're talking with Selwyn Griffiths. Remember he said, I asked him what the athlete type is now. And he said, the 800-metre runner. So all of these 800-metre runners who, maybe I don't know what a good time is for an 800-metre runner, but, maybe they're running a second less than what their PB is.
So I guess the other anomaly is Port Adelaide. They look to be firing on all cylinders at the moment. They've won 11 in a row.
And that was super impressive to finish off that last game. So there's money in punting. There's money to be made right now because of the anomalous results because of it, because people haven't clued on. And I lost on Port because I thought they would fold, but I won on the others because I got them right with the Giants and the Saints losing. But that's a really good question. And so I wonder then, Port have to go through it at some point. So if we haven't seen fatigue yet, that must be then coming up to do their block of training now. Now, they've got 2 weeks off, so they can do a full block in one go, whereas Maxi talked about us having to slice it up around these 3 9-day breaks. And he, depends whether you're confirmation bias. He sounded frustrated with it, but there's maybe some advantages with it. Keeps them at the club. It keeps them sharp. It doesn't allow, I think personally the issue with the bye is that the mental edge comes off a little bit. I mean, they have to remain at such a sharp edge to play AFL footy. If you can't will yourself to the next because you went to Bali or Noosa or something, I don't know.
All right, let's move on. Mandy Lorian says, thanks, boys, for all your efforts on the podcast so far this season. This is my favourite Demons podcast and a must listen to each and every week. The longer the better is the highlight of my week. Yes, I do have a life, but I travel a lot for work, and having you guys along for the ride makes the kilometres fly by. I would love to get the panel's thoughts on which player has been the surprise packet of the year, and conversely, which player has not lived up to expectation. Doesn't have to be negative, can be the result of an injury, etc. Well, thanks, Mandalorian, for your kind words about the podcast. I guess the three of us often, you talked about the long podcast, the three of us often wonder whether the podcast is too long. And for me, I don't mind. I love talking about the Ds, and I know these guys do too. And I'll talk to anyone who will listen for as long as they'll listen. And I know that if I like a podcast, I don't really care how long it is. I think I'll listen to it in chunks if I have to. And whenever I meet someone who does listen to this podcast, they invariably tell me that they love listening whilst walking the dog or helping a long drive fly by, like Mandy Lorian just mentioned. And it's hard keeping the length down. I don't have the time to edit the show, and I wouldn't even know where to begin to cut it down. We get a lot of questions from our listeners, and those questions have formed the nucleus of the show this year. It's working great. I wouldn't even know. I don't even know how to cut down the questions because I feel like I need to give everyone their say. We're getting more and more each week, which means the popularity is growing. There's three of us with opinions. I don't want to cut off these two experts, what they have to say. And so if it's 1.5 hours or 3 hours, well, so be it. And a pro tip.
Maybe not 3.
Pro tip.
George just fainted over.
Pro tip. You can listen at 1.25 or 1.5 speed. And, you know, we might then sound like we're junkies on speed, but it'll definitely cut down on your listening time.
Or you can go at half speed.
Yeah, and really extend it. You can do an 8-hour show. Anyway, I probably just extended this show with that monologue, but thank you again, Mandy Lorian. Back to your question. My biggest surprise packet is the Judster. He was not on my radar to play this season nor anybody else's, and we're going to talk more about him soon, as well as some of the other debutants in the red and blue later. So for brevity, I'll leave it there. Judd McVee's my biggest surprise packet this year. As to who has not lived up to expectations, I won't go the negative. As a result of injury and perhaps a little bit of form, I'm a little bit just disappointed that we've not been able to utilise Ben Brown and Tom McDonald in the way that I was hoping to this season. I guess in an ideal world, I really would have liked either one or both Benny and T-Mac to have been playing alongside JVR whilst he cut his teeth to enable him to learn from them in-game and perhaps take the heat off him by getting the second or third tall defender. But alas, that hasn't been the case. And that's my biggest disappointment of the year to date. And hopefully one or both of them can find fitness and form in the back half of the season. But we'll see how that goes. George, your biggest surprise packet and biggest disappointment, again, doesn't have to be negative, followed by you, Binman.
I think I'll go the same as you to a certain extent, Andy. Judd McVee has been an absolute eye-opener. To me, I thought he was going to be delisted at the end of last season. I watched a lot of Casey games and I didn't see anything there that was going to indicate that he was going to take that next step. However, reading certainly the article on the Melbourne Footy Club site about the work that he did in the off-season, particularly running with his grandfather, I think, just shows that regardless of talent, and I think he has talent as well, you go a long way with hard work. And he's certainly a case in point with that. On the other side, or just as another one that surprised me so far this year has been Hibbert. In the sense that I thought he was pretty well cooked.
We've all written him off
at the end of it.
21 as well.
But he's being managed and and certainly retaining his place in the side because of quality that he's producing. So that's a good. And my negative again is the same as yours with Ben Brown. It's been a disappointment more than anything. I think we tried to manage him. Certainly that was the case pre-season. For those who've been down to training, you would have seen that he was standing out of certain exercises, obviously to protect his knees. We'd heard about various operations to try and correct the problems with the knees, but it simply hasn't worked. And I don't know to this day why he wasn't in the side last week in the VFL game, but there was no indication at all.
He
He just wasn't there.
It's funny because he posted something to social media and he had this big compression bandage that went from his thigh all the way down to his ankles on one of his knees. So, and then he wasn't named in the injury list that was released today. So
that's right. Exactly. Yeah. And Tommy Max, simply because of the injuries that have occurred. We can't do anything about that. Yeah.
Big man?
I'd concur on it's a trifecta for Judd. And just for anyone who's not listened to it, I really, really loved your interview with him, and he it was fantastic. And he mentions his pop and the running, and I thought that was really interesting. That, like exactly as you said, George, it was not just the work he put in, but his pop is a sprinter. Is that right?
Yeah, he's a runner of some type.
An athlete,
athletics coach.
Yeah, right. And so, him, JVR. A couple of Wowie and one more I can't recall, all trained super hard together. Wowie has been on the sort of bubble, apparently, relatively close to selection. So all power to him. But I wrote that on Deemland. I remember talking to you, George, I don't recall him having those tricks. And I wonder whether there's some players, I always think there's some players who get better when they go up to that next level. And like in cricket, it's like Labuschagne. It's like his average was 40 odd in first class cricket, and he goes into test level, he's immediately a revelation. It's like the faster the game is, some players seem to be suited more, and he seems to be one. So he's absolutely a revelation, and he's pretty close to a best 22 lock, I would have thought. My disappointment is the question, or the
it's just a disappointment. It hasn't lived up to expectations.
Is a query? I'm not sure. There was a question last week about Gus and where he's at, and I haven't come to a conclusion on it. So I have a query, partly related to Judd McVie. Is he played such an important role last year. He was our leading intercept marker. Gus this year's pushing back. I think that's his best role. But. The other one I'm really loving that Bowie's playing his best footy again. And with Salo, you've got three halfback flankers. Where does that leave Gus? That's a really interesting question. The other one that hasn't quite come to fruition to that extent, and Speed Demon in this excellent post that that I referenced before and Demonland, it's well worth reading, mentioned that, and I agree with this, is that synergy between Gawn and Grundy hasn't quite worked out yet, has it, in terms of the way they envisioned them being forward and pushing forward. And, Grundy's been actually pretty good, forward. It's surprised me with his marking. And, as I said last week, he's a beautiful tap ruckman. But doesn't seem like they've fully worked out their synergy yet.
You know what I think has contributed to that? There's been a couple of things, and I think some of it, Gawn not playing for 4 weeks was one of them, but also the fact that Ben Brown and Tom McDonald have had the injuries. It sort of mucked up that whole forward. Like we haven't had a settled forward line at all, and I don't think Grundy or Gawn are key position forwards. It was good having them as the third tall forward, and that's why how good. Remember how good they were in the practice matches. It's a practice match, but we haven't been able to do that, and that was what we were looking. So they're now just trying to find how they're going to work without that aspect of their game.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. That's a really good point. In a way, what I was saying about what Essendon did to us that night,
that's what we wanted to do.
We were looking to do to teams, to have like a fourth tall, in one of them being Grundy or Gawn pushing forward. So it's been a bit more of a traditional, and I have to say, I actually think I prefer Grundy as a forward than Max. I'm still not 100% convinced Max is a natural forward.
I don't.
No, I agree with you there.
I don't.
And
either.
Grundy's a more reliable kick. So.
I really would prefer Gawn helping out in defence as an extra marking contested marker, whether it's down the line.
Speed Demon made an interesting comment about Grundy that he's only played 65% game time this year, which is, his comment was, whether that's about getting how long it takes to get back to AFL fitness ready, and that maybe he's still on that journey because, they all look fit to me. But, the club talked a lot about Grundy's, how much footy he missed last year and how long it takes to get back to the very, very top sort of fitness level.
Lazy says, I'll echo these statements and say the podcast has gone to a new level this year. It's currently the only one I listen to. I don't have anything to suggest out of the ordinary that you won't be talking about already. Maybe which player is the mid-year BNF, which player is the mid-year coaches award or best improver so far. So prior to the last 3 weeks, I would have thought that Clary was leading the BNF, but missing the last 3 weeks is huge. And I can only go by the Demonland Player of the Year award for guidance. I probably should promote the Demonland Player of the Year award on the podcast, or at least read out the results each week. So each week we have Demonlanders award 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 votes for the match, and Demonland's own Whispering Jack takes all the posters' names who voted that week, puts them into a hat. He picks out 3 names at random. The combined total equals the votes for that round, and a player can therefore get the maximum of 18 votes around. Currently, Petrarca is leading on 143 votes, followed by Clary on 127. There's a big gap to Viney in third on 66, Max 53, Gus 43, Grundy 40, Lever and River equal 7th on 39, May on 35, and Hunter rounds out the top 10 on 29. So for mine, Christian Petrarca's leading the BNF at this stage, and it's a 2-horse race for the Bluey with Clary nipping at track's heels. Big man, your BNF leader, if you want to answer Lazy's Coaches Award or Best Improved question, followed by you, George. Just quickly on it.
Yeah, just probably Oliver. And just on Oliver and fitness, it's quite remarkable that he was in hospital for 3 days. They're talking about it, like, just as an example of how on the bubble this is in terms of 4 days in hospital. He's lost enough condition to be a big chance of not playing this week because he's not his condition is not up to it. And the other thing, it's a bit like I was saying last week about Collingwood having COVID. The big problem of Oliver is not whether he's ready this week. It's the fact that he's probably missed a big period of heavy loading that he's not being able to do because he's been in hospital.
Yeah.
He can't make that up. That's the problem. He can't. So he may miss he may miss this week and they might load him in between heavily. So in fact, I'd be very, very surprised if he plays, and I don't think Petty will either.
We'll talk about it. You're jumping the gun here. We're talking about the BNF.
Idea about the BNF.
Okay, George, anything you want to add? All right, we'll move on. What says the 3 hours post-Filth Clash podcast was glorious. Bring on the 3-part 9-hour extravaganza of the mid-season period. I expect at least an hour each dedicated to best 23, presumably all fully fit. Well, I don't think we'll have time to talk up all 23 players, but we will talk up our debutants now. Kiwi D says, I'll second the big love for the podcast. All 3 of you offer a great insight into both our wins and losses. It's essential listening for me each week and a break from the so-called experts in the media. Thank you for your hard work and dedication in preparing and producing the podcast each week. We've had 3 debutants pull on the red and blue Guernsey this season, and all 3 have had an impact. Love to get the panel's thoughts on Brodie Grundy, Lockie Hunter and the Judster. George, back in October, we traded pick 27 for Brodie Grundy, with Collingwood picking up the tab for a significant amount of his salary whilst playing for the D's and kicking what in effect was the match-winning goal against them last week. Brodie warned the Pies that he will see them on King's birthday, so it really was poetic that his goal ended up being the difference on the day. What are your thoughts on Brodie's season to date, and how has the combination, as we've just talked about, Max and Brodie, worked in your opinion?
I'd attack this from a slightly different perspective. We lost Luke Jackson, so I was looking to see whether Grundy has replaced Luke Jackson, certainly in terms of statistics. And what I found was really remarkable was the comparisons for the averages for both players this year. Hit-outs, Grundy exceeds Jackson by a long, long way on average. Grundy averages 22 hit-outs a game. Jackson's down at 13. Even Max, on average, is 19.7. Let's call it 20. So Grundy's which sort of surprised me in a way in terms of hit-outs. Grundy is a far superior replacement for what Jackson ever was. In clearances, Grundy again exceeds Jackson, 2.8 to 2.3 clearances per game, and that compares favourably with Max at 2.9. The real standout in terms of all 3 ruckmen was Gawn with Marks. He's at 4.8. Grundy's 2.6 and Jackson 3.2. But Max is, the best ruckman in the game. It's not surprising. Likewise for contested marks, Max 2.5 a game, but Grundy and Jackson 0.8 and 1.2. Inside 50s, Grundy, amazingly, is 2.9, which compares with Max's 3.1 and Jackson 1.9. But the metres gained, Jackson 214 and Grundy down at 172. What's surprising is how good Grundy is, and comparing him with the best player the best ruckman in the competition to Max, and his clearance and inside 50s numbers are up there with the best in the game. So for us as a replacement for Jackson, I think we've found a very, very good replacement, and in fact exceeds Jackson's output. Yes, I recognise Jackson's only a young player, and he's probably playing a lot more than what he was ever expected to at Melbourne. But Grundy's been a first-class replacement for Jackson. So as a debutant, he's been fantastic for us.
Just a comment and a question. The comment is Jackson will never be a one grabber. I don't reckon. I reckon he'll be a star. I've got a lot of time for him. But Brodie's a one grabber, isn't he? But the question, George, is has anything surprised you about Brodie? Like, is he better than you thought, or?
What surprised me is how different a player he is compared to Max, even, and the clearance numbers are quite amazing. Max, I think, gets clearances simply because of a kick out of the centre.
Yeah.
He grabs it out of the ruck and kicks it, whereas Brodie is far more a follow-up and produces a different sort of result in terms of clearances in particular. But what really impressed me was post Max getting injured in the Brisbane game was how Grundy is a real grunt type ruckman. He just keeps on hanging in there during the whole game, and he has that ability, even though he lost a lot of fitness levels, obviously, from last year. But he is a real grunt player that sort of complements Max's game style. So yeah, we've certainly lost nothing, but we've gained something very different. Yeah, and I think we're yet to see the best of the combination.
And that's what surprised me, to be honest, is that I always had him pegged more as a big midfielder type runner. That was his strength, but he's much more meat and potatoes. The other interesting thing, I don't recall Collingwood doing this as often, is how often he runs out of the front of the contest.
Yeah,
they obviously set that up to create it. A few times he's muddled things up, but that's a real feature of his game. And I've really enjoyed watching him play.
After missing out on the 2021 national draft, the Demons took Judd McVie with pick 18 in the rookie draft. In April, he signed a 2-year extension with the club, which will see him move off the rookie list contract by his 4th season. He's had that meteoric rise from rookie to Casey Premiership player to permanent fixture in the Demons' formidable defence, playing all 13 matches this season after pressing selectors during the pre-season. B-Man, I know you love the Judster, so tell us why.
Love the Judster, and as I said last week, he's our best one-on-one. He's only lost, I think it was 9.1% of his one-on-one contests, the best of any of our defenders. By way of comparison, Quaynor, who I think is the best one-on-one player, mid-sized player in the AFL, is 7.2. So he doesn't really compare poorly to Quaynor at all, and he's ahead of Lever, May, Gus. Oh, wait, Gus didn't have a recording. So that's super impressive. But as I mentioned, there's some fantastic footballers, young footballers. I mean, across the AFL, really, really wonderful footballers this year that are coming to the fore. And he hasn't been spoken about that much, in terms of people are, love the time he's got on the ball. But because he's not a high possession winner like, Ashcroft, or he's, like the midfielder like Horn Francis or whatever, I know that his second year, he doesn't quite get that same attention, but against Rising Stars, he's Judd's second amongst Rising Stars for intercepts. He's first for total intercepts. He's third in amongst the Rising Stars in total rebound 50s. He's seventh amongst the Rising Stars for effective disposals. He's third in the total of amongst Rising Stars in 1%ers, which is brilliant in terms of it really speaks to his defensive strength, which is something that he said to you, Andy, on that podcast interview that he really worked on, didn't he? That that was the area of the game that I've heard Steve May say that he really had to to improve, and that's what he's done. He's gone away and improved, and I love it when players doing that. His season high at 10 contested possessions against the Bombers in that loss we had. So I love it when players play well in losing games. That's one of my favourite indicators of quality players. That's the thing I loved about Robbie Flower most. He never dropped off his performance. His season high, if you want to call it that, of clangers is 3 against the Roos way back in April. So he doesn't make many clangers. His season high of contested mark, he's only taken 1 this season high of 1. So it's not.
This is not there for that.
But against the Hawks, way back in May, 84% time on ground for a young player. I'm not sure what his average is. So he's really quietly going about putting a very impressive season together. He won't be in the Rising Star conversation, but those numbers suggest that he probably should be.
And I'd like him to get a nomination, be nice before season's end.
And by the way, we never credited JVR when he got his. That was an oversight.
Yes, JVR, thumbs up. Lockie Hunter was traded to the Demons from the Western Bulldogs for a future third-round selection right at the end of last year's trade period. He slotted in very nicely to our wingers club, joining the opposite wing to Ed Langdon and providing us with another genuine winger with a huge tank and extraordinary endurance to run up and down the huge expanses of the MCG. George, how was Lockie slotted into the side?
Seamlessly is the answer to that. Lockie was the winger we needed to have. People should recall last year we tried Spargo, Chandler, Brayshaw, ANB, JJ, all sorts of people on the wing, none of whom, as a winger, provided what we wanted. So the recruitment of Hunter has been superb, because if you reckon Ed Langdon is probably the best winger in the competition, then when you look at the statistics, they're almost identical to Hunter's, and that's what really surprised me. There's a slight differential in the disposals, where Hunter averages 21 disposals a game and Langdon 28. But in terms of all the other statistics, marks, tackles, inside 50s, time on ground, disposal efficiency, they're almost identical. The only other slight anomaly is Langdon averages 311 metres gained this year. Hunter is 410, nearly 100 metres more. So we've recruited, if Langdon was the best winger in the competition, we've recruited probably the second best on some, or the first if you want. On his day is the better one. And the beauty is, as somebody mentioned, one of the coaches, I can't remember, it might have been Chaplin, mentioned, we've got a right footer and a left footer on the wing. So they're able to take full advantage of that asset across the ground and across the game. So, Hunter has been someone that we needed, but in his 12 games, apart from his enforced game away, is producing exactly what we wanted. And if somebody had said we had a second Langdon available to us, he's certainly proved to be the case.
And you made this point earlier in the season, George, which is a really good point, that the other thing that he's brought is that we can play down either wing, and teams can't do what they were doing to us last year and keep the ball away from Langdon's wing. So it gives us some ball movement flexibility. It makes us a little bit more challenging to play, and it means that we're more likely to be able to change lanes ourselves. So he's been massive for a whole range of reasons.
Yeah, and the defensive component as well. We shouldn't forget that, previously, those other players couldn't get back to be able to defend as a group, but Hunter is back there doing exactly what Langdon does, all the time, just getting back to support the defenders when needed.
And he's a hard nut, and Goody loves his hard nuts. So
Kiwi D says, are we likely to see another debutant before season's end? And if so, who will it be? Demon WA says, looking forward to the pod. Keen to hear the panel's thoughts on which players might get a game in the run home that we haven't seen yet in 2023 debuts or otherwise. George, you've watched a lot of Casey. Can you see anyone else debuting this season, or perhaps someone else who has been forgotten in the twos getting a recall in the run home?
In all honesty, at this stage, Woden is the only one who has a reasonable chance. Most of our other players down there are development players, the Adams, the Virals, the Jeffersons, so I don't expect to see those. They're just simply not ready for AFL football under any measure at the moment. So Woden is really the only one. He was emergency for the last game and was very close from what we hear around the traps. So I'll stick with Woden as the only at this stage, but I can't see anything else.
George?
No, he's still developing very nicely, but Howe's problem's the same as a few other players have got. Who does he replace?
We've got so many halfback flankers. He's also been playing on the wing. How are you going to
keep position down there? How do you bring them in? Yeah. There's nowhere for them.
I've made the executive decision. We had 2 questions coming up. One of them I feel bad for because I'd asked him to hold it over. Me, I apologise. There's a question about the forward line. I reckon we've discussed the forward line and the forward line make up to death. You can listen to the last week's program and hear probably the same answer we're going to give now. What had something about Angus Brayshaw. I think we talked about it sufficiently last week as well, so I'm going to move on from that. We're going to go into changes because we're already about 2.5 hours into this and we still haven't discussed the Geelong game, so let's get going. Radelaide asked, with Clary and Petty likely return this week, the big question is who will come in and who will be omitted. The other player you missed, Radelaide, was Jake Bowie, who should be back in contention after his stint in concussion protocols following the Blues game. Goody spoke about both Clary and Petty's chances for making a return to the team this week, and this is what he had to say.
Morning, Simon. We saw Clayton Oliver running around the MCG after the King's birthday game. How's he progressing?
Yeah, look, he's progressing well. We're hopeful. Both he and Harrison Petty have got a couple of important sessions to go. We've sort of got match committee later today, but those two especially, we're hopeful, but we're certainly not certain by them. We need to make sure they train well today and also again on Wednesday. So, we're hopeful, but we're certainly not, declaring them at this point.
I'd imagine spending all that time in hospital, you would have lost a bit of conditioning. Is that going to be an issue coming into this game?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the things that we've got to check off on. We've got 2 really important sessions coming up. Obviously, spending 5 days in hospital isn't ideal, so making sure that he's got the load required, he's training to the level, and he's ready to go. And it's really about performance of both of them. So we've got to make sure they're right and set them up the best way to perform the best. And the next couple of sessions are really important for that. So as I said, we probably won't know till later in the week.
Yeah, Harrison Petty as well. What's his situation?
Yeah.
Is he likely or?
Yeah, they're both the same. Very similar. Harrison's sort of been building up his program. As I said, we're hopeful for him as well. But we need to make sure in the next couple of sessions that we get the loads into him required to perform, and that's really important for us because obviously it is about performance. So making sure that they're ready to perform, and we won't take any risk with any players. So we're hopeful with him, as we are with Clayton, that they'll both be available and ready to go and ready to perform.
Just going back to Clayton, I know you already addressed Simon, but obviously you'll need to train strongly today, but is that a late call potentially, or do you think you'll probably know by today or how he pulls up tomorrow, and one of those ones that you won't risk him given it's such a long season, he's so important?
Yeah, I think we'll know once we get through today's session and see how he pulls up tomorrow, and obviously we've got another session on Wednesday, but as I said, they're 2 important sessions, but we'll know a bit more today where he's at, both physically and whether he's prepared and ready to perform to the level that we are. And it's the same with Harrison as well. So we'll know more once we get through today. As I said, we've come off a bye, we've had 4 days away, we're back to work, but this is our first really big session that we need to make sure that we have a really good look at where we're at and how we prepare best. But as I've said along, we won't take any risk with any player. We want to make sure we prepare our group to sustain our performance throughout the whole year, and we'll make sure we make that decision later in the week.
So big man, was Goody just foxing then and keeping his cards close to his chest? We often say Goody, and you say it as well, Goody tells it like it is. He doesn't play games. If that's the case, then perhaps neither or only one might be playing.
I reckon either will play. And here the code, big session. They got big sort of work to do on the track, and so they'll have to do them. But it'll take the edge off them. Will they play them? I would be very, very surprised if either play, to be honest. And for me, it's interesting because if this was a target game, they probably would play. They picked their best 23. So they as I said, they talked, about being flexible in terms of how they manage their play, and they have been, haven't they? Salo coming straight back in with no VFL time, Hibbo being rested, and on-field strategies like time on ground and rolling players through the middle. So they've been flexible and using those techniques to manage and spread the load and do those sorts of things. And as I say, this was a target game. Their best 23. But if it's not a target game, maybe they manage some players, and so maybe they give JVR a spell. I mean, he's only 19, so he's a young player who must be pretty fatigued. Or maybe they won't do this, but maybe give Maxi a chance to have a good break, or Brody so he can have a good run in the ruck by himself. Given that we've got 9 days on the other side of this to rest up, they won't take any risk with Petty and Oliver, partly because of those 9 days. Spargs looks like he's paddling a bit. Maybe he could have a break. Maybe Cozzy, Chin, Howes or Wowie could come in. They're probably not likely to make many changes, but I don't think Petty or Oliver will play.
Further to that, Channel 9 news reporter Braden Ingram said he posted some pictures of Oliver at training. A watch on Clayton Oliver appeared in discomfort leaving Demons' main session with trainers, referencing the same hand he had surgery on last year. He's now back out there. Simon Goodwin said he still has to prove he's fit to return after hamstring and infection. So
it's the Selwood gift that keeps on giving, doesn't it? Bloody hell.
So that's his hand as well. So add that to the hamstring and the blisters.
And I think it was in Kev's track report, or someone else said that the concern for Petty was his lateral movement, that he's running okay in straight lines, but it's his lateral movement that they're worried about.
So that's interesting. George, anything to add in changes for this week?
No.
Bowie,
I actually think the most likely is JVR if we're talking about loading at this time, and he's 19 and he's been playing more games than perhaps he was slated to at the start of the season. In the absence of Brown and McDonald, I think he's likely to more likely to come out. And I think Petty might come in to replace him. I think they'll stick with Joel Smith.
I think
in the forward.
Yeah. So Bowie, who if he's back from concussion, our back line, where how does he slot in there? Who comes out for him?
Yeah, that's the big question. Again, if you're going to rest someone, who do you rest in the back line? Certainly not Salo at the moment. It's going to be a hard call.
Well,
which is why I'm fascinated by selection this week, because if they are looking to take a Geelong methodology a bit more this year, then they will look to rest some players. It was an anathema last year. They didn't do it, but exactly right, George. JVR probably does need a chop out. Spargs looked completely spent last week and was subbed out. Maybe they give him a chop out and Laurie comes in. Maybe they want to give Wowie or Howes a game, or Wowie if you think he's more likely, and maybe you manage a couple of players. Smitty definitely stays in, and I think Smith is he's got that spot for the time being. I think.
Yeah.
Now, just to be clear, though, the pictures that the guy posted of Oliver and the report on his hand, that was the session that Goody was referring to.
Yeah.
That his presser obviously was
big
before
session
that.
number 1, big session number 2 on Wednesday.
Well, the Wednesday, wouldn't that be the captain's run, which isn't usually a big session?
That's true. He was talking about,
Yeah, the big session was today.
If they do a big session, well, then it's more evidence that they're going super hard at the moment.
Yeah.
Less likely we'll win.
All right. Goody dropped another tidbit in the presser. So have a listen to this. I'm not sure whether you're across this. You might have seen it on Demonland today, or if you listened to the presser, you would have heard it.
Yeah, look, they played the ground incredibly well. They're the reigning premier and they're the best team in it, until proven otherwise. So we know what we're up against. We're going to train, with the dimensions of the Geelong ground today. We want to get used to what it's like to play down there. We'll move down there and train down there on Wednesday. So we want to make sure that we're as best prepared possible to play a really strong footy team that play that ground incredibly well. So we're going to leave no stone unturned in our preparation for the game that we're coming up against. And you're right, coming off the bye has been a challenge for teams, but we want to make sure that we be a team that actually hits the ground running. We've only had 10 days, so we've had 4 days off and we've got back to work pretty quickly. So we feel like we're in a good position to take on that challenge.
So are you planning to spend the night down there, are you?
Yeah. So we're moving our program down there on Wednesday and treat it like a game away from home and spend a night in a hotel and train down there and prepare ourselves as best we can. We've played down there a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. We've had some success. We've also had some pretty average performances, but we want to treat it like an away game and head down the highway and train and get to work.
Is that the first time you've done it, or are you just mixing up? Or?
No, this is the first time we've done it, but as I said, we want to make sure that we prepare ourselves as best we can, and this is part of preparation. You don't play down there very often, from year to year. So we've played down there a few times in the last few years, but we want to train down there. We want to get used to the environment and we want to set it up, that we prepare as best we can. And this is one of those ways that we can do it.
So where do you train when you're down there? Do they let you train on their ground, or do you have to go elsewhere?
Yeah, no, we'll train on their ground. So we'll get used to the dimensions, and just like every other away game, whether it's Adelaide Oval or Optus Stadium, you always get to train at that ground. So we'll go down there and train on Wednesday and prepare as best we can for Thursday night.
And no, you didn't just get a notification. That was a notification on my work computer today whilst I was cutting that audio. So George, what do you think about Goody's bombshell that we will effectively be treating this game as an interstate match, sleeping in Sleepy Hollow, getting to train at their skinny venue like we do for any other interstate match? It's sort of one of these experiments, B-Man, you talk that Goody's been doing. So, George, what do you think about this?
Yeah, the players will be absolutely ecstatic about spending an extra night in Geelong, but at least they'll be able to concentrate on their football because there's not much else to do down there. It's not called Sleepy Hollow.
They love playing in Adelaide, so they should be.
Yeah, well, that was the next, second prize is Adelaide, they don't call it Sleepy Hollow for nothing, and but yeah, it does make sense. I mean, everybody once again says it's only an hour. It's an hour drive down the road. Yeah, well, it's not the same. It's an extra hour, and the opportunity to play on the ground beforehand to hone your skills on that sort of ground, I think is definitely advantageous. You can replicate it to a certain extent by putting cones around any training facility that you're at, but there's nothing like on the actual ground itself. So it sounds like a sensible idea.
I wonder whether part of it too is what Goody said is about post-bye, bringing all the boys together in the one spot and all of the support staff and the coaches, and like they often talk about how they like going on interstate trips because it's an opportunity for all the players to get together. If it was just driving, everyone would wake up at, whatever, well, not wake up, it's a night game, but, everyone would come from different points in Melbourne and Brown's Cows come down to Cardinia Park. This gets them all down there. Although Goody said at one point in that clip that they're all going to move there. That's a big logistical challenge between now and then to buy enough houses for 44 trains.
So I thought that's good. It's innovative by Goody, so I like that. I think it's a good thing. I think Geelong would have been shocked that another team.
How keen would they be having the Demons run around on the?
Oh, they wouldn't. They probably like the fact that no one gets to run on the butt. That's what you do at West Coast and at Adelaide and wherever else. Why should it not be
paid by the taxpayers?
That's right. We're paying
so
for
any
that.
taxpayer should be able to kick the footy down there.
Yeah. So. I like it. Let's hope that anyone in the Geelong offices, I don't know if they have windows that look onto it, just make sure they're boarded up so they don't see what we're doing. Let's get into the preview of the Cats proper. We've only got a couple more things to go, so if you're stuck with us this far, thank you. AF says, as promised, Andy, here is my question from the Collingwood podcast thread, but relevant to the Geelong game. Do we think we'll allow +1 at the contest against Geelong in the Collingwood game? We even this up in the final quarter. Demonland poster Lucifer's Hero has pointed out before that the +1 that we allowed last time against Geelong, do we allow it for 3/4 or even most of the match and tweak it if necessary? Big man, you're our resident stoppages specialist and you always keep an eye on the numbers that we tend to bring to stoppages. What do you think of what AF has asked?
It depends a little bit where they are with their, with the fatigue, I guess. But I would generally say no. I mean, particularly Geelong. Geelong aren't like Collingwood in the way that they feed it out to that outside ring. So they're not the same threat in the same way. Geelong is like playing us, really, the way they play. I mean, the big thing about Geelong is the way they empty out the forward line and, engineer Hawkins one out. That's what we've got to be mindful of. And what they did last year is changed our game plan a little bit, the way they attacked Gawn at the contest and won the ball down the front of it. Remember, Blickharves was really brilliant in that, but we're much less predictable with our kickouts now to make that much more of a challenge to attack Maxi, basically. So no is a short answer. I can't see them. I think it was very specific against Collingwood, unless we're getting smashed up at the stoppages and they want to,
that won't happen this week.
No, not without
Really
Dangerfield in
confident.
particular.
Yeah, I'll talk about that later on, but yeah, it won't happen this week.
Oh, do you need to talk about it now or is it somewhere else? Oh, when we talk about the what to win, we'll win. Okay. All right, so let's move on. Red Jacket asks, with an eye on matchups for the game at the Cattery, who will we see match up on Hawkins, Cameron and Rohan? Who's going to take Stengel? Who will man close? George, take us through who you think will man up on who in defence. I know we play his own defence and often on turnovers those matchups don't always pan out, but who's going to be lining up who against who at the centre bounce?
I'm not a fan of all this lineup stuff because that's not the way we play as a general rule. You play as a team and a zone, things like that. I don't think we need to worry about Geelong as much this year as what we perhaps would have last year, particularly at the second half of the season.
Their forwards can still be very dangerous.
Cameron's the dangerous forward, although he plays a long way up the ground. They're small forwards. Played very well last week until the supply dropped off. So again, we'll talk about that later. But I don't think we've got any problems with the way our defence operates to deny people like Rowan and Close and Myers what they want to do, because I don't think they're just going to get the opportunities like they have in the past.
Right, a big key will be stopping Myers. So I think McVie will get Stengel. He's had that sort of similar role. I'd be very surprised if he doesn't. Myers is really important to them. He's like number one in the AFL for inside. He's barely missed an inside 50 kick. He's extraordinary. He's got that skill to kick across the body, which is becoming increasingly an important skill. So it'll be interesting to see how they play him. I'm hoping someone, or probably not Rivers, like you say, that was, maybe Bowie comes back in and he takes him. But I feel like McVie will take Stengel. And Stengel is exactly the sort of player we struggle with, I think. And so it's another big challenge for McVie, but I think he's up to it. And he hasn't been as dynamic this year, Stengel, has he? He's really dropped off in terms of his output.
Yep.
In fact, I'd say Myers is just about their most dangerous
at the moment,
small forward now. Yeah,
definitely. Yep.
Pew 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 says the Cats have a number of tall defenders, but could that work in our favour with our smaller forward line? And the Cats do indeed have a very tall back line. De Koning, Stewart, Henry, Guthrie. B-Man, does the tall timber in Geelong's defence work in our favour on what could be a cold and wet night at the Cattery?
Not sure. Potentially. I mean, one of the things that we'll need to do, and it'll be interesting to see whether maybe Fritsch will play on Stewart again in the same way he played on Moore, because Stewart is so important. Like if you can minimise his influence there, I mean, a bit like us and Lever, but even more so, they're so reliant on him taking intercept marks. Their whole defensive structure he's the anchor to it. And so if you can somehow minimise his impact, so, a lot of that will be, as George said, it's not really about who. Maybe Fred will take him away from it if they fall for that. But it'll be Smith will play an important role being that second player, same with Lever, across to the contest and just make sure that he doesn't mark it, because if he starts marking it, and he did last year, he cut us up. And, you've just got to stop him marking it. And I think there's been a super emphasis in the last few weeks of preventing the opposition marking the footy. And that will be really important for this match, I think.
And the other thing I think we get concerned about what happened last year. It's what happened this year with the Geelong defenders. They were missing Stewart and Henry for a long time.
And didn't they miss Stewart? Like they were completely different.
Completely. But those players aren't from what I saw this week in particular. Those players aren't. If you follow the loading and training schedules, when you lose that sort of time, particularly early on in the season, you don't get it back, and they are not the players that they were last year.
Yeah, exactly. You don't get it back, and that's it. Like that's the sort of that's a major concern for them, and they're struggling, aren't they? They're struggling to cover the ground. They haven't got that physical strength advantage over other teams at the moment. They're still a very powerful team, so they'll certainly win a lot of games in this back half of the season. Partly because I think they've got 6 games or something at Cardinia Park, which is.
But the evidence was last week against Port. The Port kicked 11 goals straight, 11 straight against their defenders.
Yeah, and part of that was the pace of the movement, wasn't it?
Yeah,
they couldn't get across, and once Port started moving it quick, they really struggled to get across and cover it.
Royal Demon says, I thought I'd let you know that I had to fly from London to Frankfurt and then back again for work, and I was able to listen to the whole of the last podcast on the commute there and back. Thanks for being my wingman. Are you guys concerned about the 2023 bye curse? All teams this season coming off the bye have lost the next week, with the exception of the Saints, who played the Swans, who are also coming off the bye. Love that you were able to take us on that trip and back as well. I hope you've got another long flight booked this week, because I think we're 2:48 at the moment. You might need it for this one. It's true. All teams this season, with the exception of the Saints, who played another team coming off the bye, have lost post-bye. I don't have any stats to prove whether this is a problem historically. I know Geelong have that history of losing. It is. I know Geelong have that.
Well, not as dramatic as this year, but it's always there's always anomalous results around this time of year, partly to do with what I was saying before about the extra training they do in this time.
Yeah, so
that's why I think they stagger it.
So we should be right because we haven't. We should be right because we haven't had a bye.
I was actually going to say that it won't be a problem for us because we got screwed with not having buys.
For the second year in a row, we don't get a bye.
All right, so no buys for us. Now we get to the why we're going to win or lose. George, take us through how and why we will win this game and put a dent in Geelong's finals aspirations in 2023. George?
Turn the mic on first, George. So that helps. Firstly, I watched the game against Port, and it was a game of not just 2 halves, but a game of a quarter and 3/4 of the game. Firstly, Geelong don't have Dangerfield this week, and they also don't have Cam Guthrie. There's two of the best midfielders not playing.
Guthrie's almost as big out as Dangerfield.
And in the Port game, they lost Dangerfield in the first quarter, and that was the end of it. The ball simply didn't come out because no Guthrie, no Danger. They had Mitch Duncan back this week, but the next level of Geelong mids is not up to the same sort of standards. So that's their first problem. The second problem, as I alluded to before, is the number of injuries they've had up to this date. They certainly cannot take the run that they were able to generate last year. Those players like Stewart and Henry have been critical out for us. Henry in particular, I think, is an absolute cog in their backline to take those intercepts alongside Stewart. They've been out for a long time. They're simply not playing the same sort of level as what they have before. The other thing I noticed in the Port game, which is a real concern for Scott, is that Geelong, after Dangerfield went off, reverted to the chipping game. They went back to chip and kick. That tells me that they can't run. That's simple as that. Right. And if Geelong can't run and they're missing their midfield to provide the drive to get it down the forward line, they're in serious trouble. So that's why we can win. I think the reality of Geelong and the overall picture is that the old bodies, despite getting through last year, are not getting through this year, and they're starting to suffer as a result. They've got too many players who are too old and can't keep up the pace of the game.
And their season, it's just really interesting. I reckon their season this year is mirroring our season last year. They won the flag. They came in. Players had that less break to the next season. They've got a number of injuries, they have rolling injuries. They haven't been able to get their fitness levels to the point where they are. So really, really similar. And they've got a crazy hard run home. They've got, apart from the fact that they've got so many games down at Cardinia Park. So it's almost a complete mirror image of our season last year, I reckon. Well, it's almost the same in many ways as ours, mirror in the sense that it's the opposite.
Now, Big Man, you shocked me to the point of almost falling out of my chair the other day, and even you repeated again tonight when I read the following from you, and I quote, "By the by, I think there is every chance the Cats will beat us." This remark from Positive Binners sent a shiver down my spine just when I thought I had my MFCSS firmly under control. You, the most confident person I know in the D's ability to win any and every game and overcome any challenge thrown at us. When you make a comment like that, well, I've been in a downward spiral for a week and those comments are living rent-free inside of my head. So tell me why you would say such a heretical thing.
Well, it's simple, is that we're smashing them on the track right now. And so whatever way you figure, whatever the ways the weeks line up, we know we're in the middle of it. And this increased training load, that, whatever you want to call it, is that there's no question. So it just makes it a complete, as a punter, this is you can make some money, but you can lose money at this stage of the year because there's so many anomalous results. So the only, I'll put it this way, I'll be happy if we win. Because we'll be exhausted, they'll be exhausted. If we miss our goals and they kick their goals, if we can walk away with 4 points, I'll be thrilled. That's the stat that was read out before, is a pretty powerful stat. That's 7, 8, how many teams have come back and not been able to win after a bye? That starts to be statistically quite relevant. So that's a challenge. We're obviously travelling down there to partly overcome that. But yeah, I just think we'll be fatigued. They will be too, to an extent. I was actually really surprised. I thought they'd set themselves a port, but they ran out of gas in that last quarter, as George was saying. So they may well have run out of gas too. They might be we might be playing on exactly the same level playing field. But I just think it'll be a scrappy game at night where we'll be fatigued. They'll be fatigued. Anything could happen. It's on a shitty ground that's not really AFL standard. I just think that they play it in a particular way. It's a bit like the Gabba stuff. Their game is suited for it. They strategically know what they're going to do. So I'm going in thinking that, if we win, that's a bonus. If we lose, it doesn't really matter. So it doesn't tell me, if we lose this game, it won't tell me anything for our flag chances.
Yeah, because in the game against Port, they got it. They went out hard. They had a great lead.
Port, I thought
They kicked 6 goals in the first quarter.
Yeah, Port then got to about 30 points up, and then Geelong sort of clawed it back to 12, I think, in the last quarter before they got overrun.
It was their lack of leg pace in the last half that was the most disturbing. So what I'll be really interested to watch, because we played specifically that defence, super hyper defence against the Blues and Carlton, who both threatened to run at us hard. I don't think Cats can do that. So I wonder whether we might do something different and play fast ourselves and challenge the Cats. And I really hope we do, because I think that will increase the chances of us winning. And one of the things I'd love to see, a Howes or a Wowie or some new fresh energy coming into the team, because I think that might add something at this time. Midwinter down Thursday night. It's going to be cold and wet that night as well. So it'll be interesting, interesting to see which way Goody goes. And it won't surprise me at all if we go fast and try to score fast.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there for tonight. We'll be back next week, hopefully discussing another famous victory at the Cattery. I'll work out with you boys shortly when we'll be doing the show, as I'll be off for a well-earned break, loading for my run into finals. But we'll get to the Cats review for you over the weekend. If you want to listen to the show live, please keep an eye out for the podcast thread on demonland.com that I'll create after the game on Thursday night. Thank you to our 5-star reviewers for Feebaloo, Lucy H, Luann and Heather. Thank you to our Demonland posters who submitted questions and comments. Thank you to Bigfoot, Skrull, Stu, Red and Blue Rising, D-Zone, Singer, Ross Million, 640 MD, Mandy, Lorian, Lazy, What, Say What, Kiwi D, Demon WA, D Me, Radelaide, AF Red Jacket, Pew Pew Pew, and Royal Demon. Thank you to my co-hosts as always, George and Midman, and thank you to you, our loyal listeners, for sitting through another we're almost 3 hours. Let me know if you made it all the way to the end. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts, and we'll read it out on the next show. See you next week. Go Demons.
Go Red Leggers.